All right. I don't know if we're live yet, but we should be started, and hopefully everybody can hear things okay. So you just let me know if you can hear the Kronos okay as well. Hey Dirk, how's it going? No snow there yet, huh? Okay, so just let me know in the chat real quick if you can hear everything okay. I just want to make sure that things are actually up and running. I have a tendency to try and be okay with software and technology, and sometimes it eludes me. So, hi Alberto. Oh, perfect. Alberto, great to hear from you. Hope you're having an excellent new year. Matthew, thanks for joining. Yeah, we're going to take some time, and basically, all I wanted to do is just have an opportunity to basically ask any question you want, whether it's, me or the Kronos or, that kind of thing. Scott, thanks for jumping in. Richard, awesome. So I don't actually have anything in particular that I wanted to talk about. Like, I know some live streams, they'll have like an agenda or that kind of thing. I don't have anything like that. So really, for me, I wanted to just offer this as a chance to just be like, hey, how would you do this? Or how might you approach this? Or that kind of thing. So really, anything that you guys wanted to talk about, I am down. And if I can't find an answer, like, I don't know everything about the Kronos. I do know quite a bit, and we're going to see what we can do to get an answer for you. Mimo Chow, okay, thank you. Abraham, great. Watching from Ghana, Africa. That's awesome. So Dirk's suggesting you put a mask on the Kronos. It looks great and protects it. So when you say a mask, do you mean like one of these kinds of masks? Here we go. We could do this like a face mask just to cover the Berlin, just stay safe and socially distanced. We could do that. Okay, so a plastic mask, okay. Birendra, I probably totally mutilated that pronunciation. Hello, great to see you here. No, not that kind of mask. Okay, that's fair. That's totally fair. All right. Okay, so you can buy them in Germany. Actually, I was looking for some sort of something that I could use to keep my NanoPad. Well, I guess you can see it here in the other camera. I wanted to try and find a way to mount the NanoPad. Like, I don't know. I've seen some people have 3D printed like arches that come up over, and you can stick the NanoPad in there. And that's always interested me. So I'm curious to see what other kinds of things exist out there. Custom drum programming. So that's definitely something that we can take a look at. Lazy Lops. Hello from Ireland. Well, hello from Canada. Gavin, nice to see you again, man. It's been a while. Yeah, hope things are going well. Is it Jur or Gur? Ottman? Okay, so we've got some questions right away. This is exciting. Okay, so Scott's saying, so first question, I have your 8090 package and Cars package. How do I load them both at the same time as well as my personal set list? Okay, so this is a really good question, and I'm immediately going to jump away from the Kronos right away, and I'm going to be jumping into something called PCG Tools. So I'm not going to get into the crazy details of it all, but I'll show you the basic premise. So PCG Tools, let me just share my desktop, so you should be able to see that now. And if I don't get to everybody's questions, I'll certainly do my best to try. So Maddie's just asking, what did you say I've had with something mean by 3D printer? So I just meant somebody had a 3D printed kind of holder for the Korg NanoPad here, and it kind of stuck on the top of the Kronos, and it was just like this little bridge, like a little arch, and you were able to clamp certain things into it to make it easier for performance, because live, one of the issues that I have is that my stuff doesn't have a place to fit on the Kronos unless I wanted to put Velcro on it, and I really don't want to do that. So that's what I was talking about. Okay, so let me see. So answer Scott's question. We've got a couple of other things. So Grace Note Music, thanks for joining. Advanced layering and splits, we can look at that. Presley, morning, thanks. Having trouble with KSF and KMP files, saving and opening. We'll definitely take a look. Okay, awesome. So, to address Scott's first question, so when you have multiple packages, how do you load things at the same time? And one of the tools that I use is something called PCG Tools. So PCG Tools, this was created by a wonderful man named Michael Kaisers, and this was developed a fairly long time ago, back in 2011. I guess it started with maybe the Korg M3 or the prior to the Oasis. So it was around that time, and he's made it open source. So if you develop in like .NET, you can actually add to it yourself. But he's made this tool which allows you to take PCG files, which stands for Program, Combi, and Global, and this is basically like a configuration file. And it allows you to merge them on your computer. So it doesn't exist because it's running .NET. I don't think it's been programmed for like Mac or Linux. So you do have to run this on Windows. But generally speaking, this PCG Tools, even if you've got Mac and you can do something like Boot Camp where you can boot into both Windows and Mac, or if you wanted to have like a virtual PC, like a virtual computer that you can run, and you can run Windows inside of the virtual machine instance. Anyway, this program works offline. So a lot of people think this program just ties directly into the Kronos and just starts manipulating the Kronos directly. And that's not quite how this software works. So this PCG Tools, what it does is it edits the PCG files offline. So what you need to do is you need to get the Kronos files, the PCG files that you want to merge, and put them together. So typically speaking, what you're going to have, if I were to grab, let's say, the 80s 90s sound pack, I'm just going to open this up, and I'm going to also open up, at the same time, I'm going to open up something like my band set list. I guess this is from 2020, September. Okay, so I've got a couple of windows open, and the way this generally works is you've got this window, which is going to be my PCG file that is my latest backup. And so if I were to look at some of the files here, I might see like some of the names of different sounds that I have loaded and that kind of thing, right? So this is going to be my existing Kronos backup. So generally speaking, what you would need to do in your Kronos is, in the Kronos, you go to disk mode. And in disk mode, I'm just going to go back to my root directory here. In disk mode, you want to go to the Save tab, and in the menu drop down at the very top, you can say Save PCG. Now you could say select like Save All, and this is going to save your PCG and sequencing data. It's going to save your sampling data and all of that kind of stuff. But what you can do is just say Save PCG, and this is going to save the PCG file. This is basically the current loaded sounds in your Kronos. And there's different memory sets or different types of memory, and I'll get into that maybe a little bit later. But generally speaking, you've got live loaded memory, and this live loaded memory is where your sounds are coming from this very second. And there's different types, like there's sample memory, which can be loaded at the same time. So what you do is you make a backup. And this backup in your Kronos, you can save it into like a backups folder. I actually did that not that long ago. So you've got your backups here. So this is my backup file. And what we'll do is you've got this backup file then open in PCG Tools. You also have to open any of the other sound sets that you wanted to load. So for example, this 80s, 90s sound pack, this is just one of the ones that I've created in the past. If you wanted to load everything, here's kind of the way I would suggest doing it. And there's no hard, fast rule. There's a couple of different ways you can approach it, but generally speaking, here's what you do. So you want to go into set lists, and I tend to think of it as like a top-down kind of mentality, where set lists are going to contain, all of the kind of shortcuts, because a set list mode is nothing more than a bunch of shortcuts to either programs or combis or songs. So in this case, what I would do is I would go to set list mode, and I would copy the song that I wanted. So this is probably like, this is the main reason I kind of divided it this way, is if you wanted an individual song, you could just click on it and say, okay, Hunger Like the Wolf. This isn't like fairly simple combi. So what I could do is I have the ability to just say copy. So I can go from edit to copy. There's a copy button down here. And what's going to happen is when I say copy, it's going to copy the set list itself. So not the whole set list, but the set list block that I have selected. But it's also going to copy all of the combis and programs that are used from this set list. They're all linked together. So I'm actually going to choose Rebel Yell just to give you a better idea, because there's more sounds in that one. So with Rebel Yell, I select all of the sounds that I want to use. So in this case, my set list items. I'm going to say copy. And when I do, down at the very bottom, it says clipboard. And it says 2 HD1 programs, 4 EXI programs, 7 combis, and 7 setlist slots. So it's telling me exactly what's been copied to make sure that when I paste this stuff into my backup, right, this is my backup file here, when I move all of these sounds over to the backup file, it's going to keep the associations, because that's something that the Korg Kronos doesn't do. When you load a combi, it just loads the combi information in. It doesn't dynamically link where the sounds belong, so that your combi could have, 15 layers correct, but one layer that's pointing to the wrong spot, and suddenly things don't sound correct. And this is what often happens. So just somebody saying in the chat, let me see here. Custom bass pattern in Karma, is it possible? It is. Well, we can talk about that briefly. I'm not a Karma master by any stretch of the imagination. So when Richard's asking, like, where would you start with Karma? I can show you kind of how I approach things. It may not necessarily be the right aspect for approaching things, but I've managed to kind of, muddle my way through Karma as much as I can. So I can show you some of the things that I do. Nagi, Happy New Year to you as well. So, looking at PCG Tools, once you've copied the stuff you want to move over, and you've hit copy, and you can see it in the clipboard down at the bottom of the screen here, what you need to do is you need to choose where it goes. So for set lists, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to go to set list 10, and this is like a new set list block. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to paste, and this is going to paste just the set lists. So this hasn't put combis in anywhere. It hasn't put programs in anywhere. It doesn't have that information yet because it's still sitting in the clipboard. Okay. So I've got my Rebel Yell, and I'm just going to rename this here. So if you double click, you can rename the set list. So Rebel Yell. Okay. So there's my set list. And this is my set list block list. Now if I go to combis, I have to paste my combis as well. So I'm going to go to my user E block, and I'm going to say paste. And when I do, it pastes all of the individual combis. Now, here's the interesting thing. Each one of these sounds, each program, and each combi has a generated hash file that basically says this is independent or this is special in some way. So a hash file just basically is a mathematical algorithm that basically shows that a file has an independent special key. So if you were to compare two files to one another, if one piece changes, that hash file changes as well. So when you paste these sounds in, if those programs already exist in the Kronos, it's going to try and point to them. It's going to try and say, okay, these sounds already exist, so it knows where they are. So for example, if I go into my combis and I go timbres, it shows me the timbres that are used for this combi, and these sounds already exist. So they're already in the Kronos. So if I were to, normally what I would do to keep going is I would go to program mode and I would keep pasting, but you'll notice my clipboard's actually empty because the programs that it needs, it found, and it was able to like dynamically link straight to them. So that's kind of neat. Now, instead, perhaps you wanted to load something else. So I'm going to load maybe something else that's not in the 80s, 90s PCG because those sounds are currently already loaded in this backup, so it's going to find those files. So instead, maybe what I want to do is I've got my backup file here. I'm going to open up something else. So maybe, I think that's already there, but I don't think this one is. So this Uptown Funk thing. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy my combi. So this is a good general way of moving files around as this PCG file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab, I'm thinking in a hierarchy, the most broad thing I can think of. So instead of copying like each individual program, I'm going as broad as possible. So I'm saying, okay, this doesn't have any set lists associated with it. So I'm going to go Uptown Funk main. This is my combi, so this is the most broad that I can go. I'm going to say copy, and it copies that into the clipboard. So here we've got the Kronos. It's 6 HD1 programs, 7 EXI programs, and 1 combi. So now when I go back to my backup, I can go to combi mode, and I'm going to scroll right up to the top. Here we go. There's our Rebel Yell stuff. So I'm just going to put this right after that. So I'm going to say paste. And when I do, it has Uptown Funk main. The next thing I could do is I could go into programs, and because there's 2 types of banks, in the Kronos, there's the HD1 bank and an EXI bank. So the EXI bank, you could click here and then go paste. And once again, apparently I have this loaded because it found the programs. But normally you'd have to hit paste in EXI, and this is going to paste your EXI programs. And then you also have to go to HD1 and click paste, and this would paste your HD1 programs. And so here's the big difference. If you're not already aware, EXI is basically an expansion engine, and those ones were, this is going back to days of like the Korg Oasis. So in the Korg Oasis, when it first came out, I believe, did it have 4 engines, or maybe it only started off with 1 and then it added some after? But at any rate, the HD1 engine was the main engine, and this HD1 engine is your sample playback engine. This is the one that actually plays samples. So these samples could be user-generated samples. They could be samples that are stored in the ROM of the Kronos, or as well as some expansions. And that's not to say that some EXI banks don't also use samples, because they do, and we can talk about that as well if you're curious. But generally speaking, the HD1 engine is the engine that's used to, utilize or manipulate samples. And this was the engine that was used to generate all of the sounds on the Oasis way back in the day when it first came out. And eventually what happened is expansions came out, and these expansions were basically Linux-based VSTs. And so those VSTs had additional functions and features besides just playing samples, where it could do things like model, and this is where the SGX piano comes in. It could do things like model harmonic resonance. So when you actually play on the piano and you hold a chord down and hit like a large something, like if you were to go into programs and just hold down like a chord and then hit like a low note, you'll hear the resonance of the upper chords in the piano and that kind of thing. So that ability to add mathematical modeling or add mathematics to generate sound waveforms. This is basically the difference between HD1 and EXI. So the EXI generates it through software, where the HD1 engine, it's technically software as well, but it's more samples that are being played back as opposed to generating the sound mathematically using either modeling or some sort of additional, logic that's being applied to the waveform. So that's the technical explanation. So yeah, with EXIs, or not with EXIs, but with PCG files and moving sounds around, that's exactly how I would do that. Is I would open up PCG Tools, get my backup, copy things as broadly as possible, and then paste them into the next kind of free slot. And hopefully, Scott, that kind of answers your question. I tend to be verbose when I explain things, so I apologize if I'm rambling a bit. Okay. So next question. So let me see. Advanced layering and splits. Well, if you can give me a little bit more specific example there, Grace Note Music, I will certainly take a look at it. What I wanted to do is, if you've got like, a song in mind, maybe that's something that we could look at, and I could show you how I would approach that. Presley, so your question was, you're having trouble with KSF and KMP files transferring, saving, opening them specifically. Okay, so Happy New Year to you as well. And let me tell you a little bit about sampling and KSC and KMP files and that kind of thing. So when I'm looking on the Kronos, let me see if I can bring up a screen here. So I've got my disk mode, and I'm going to go into my sample library. Okay, so let's take a look at kind of the format or the layout of how things are set up when you are actually using PCG files or KSC files or KMP files and those kinds of things. Hey Lou, thanks for joining. Okay, so when it comes to different memory types, I have to apologize, but this is the best way that I can kind of explain this conceptually, which is I'm going to draw you a picture very poorly in MS Paint. So you should stand in awe of my amazing MS Paint abilities. This is going to be so bad. Okay, so in the Kronos, you have a bunch of different types of memory. Now, if I'm going to be technical, and I'll try and make it as simple as possible as well, because I want to talk about both the technical side and then the kind of direct, easier way to digest the memory. So in the Kronos, the Kronos is actually basically a Linux engine that's running. Well, it's running Linux. It's running a stripped-down version of Red Hat Linux, and it more or less runs VSTs. But what happens is you have files that are loaded when the Kronos first boots up, and so there's basically 3 different types of memories that exist. So I'm going to draw those in 3 different colored boxes. So I'm going to say, okay, here's one type of memory. We've got a second type of memory. So let's use green, and this. No, let's change that back to red. Then let's start a new one, and this one can be green. And we'll start another one. I guess we'll go sky blue. This one. Oh, shoot, I did it again. There we go. Let's try sky blue. Okay. There we go. Awesome. Thanks, Jim. I'm glad to know that you're enjoying the Sound Cars pack. That's fantastic. I love hearing that kind of thing. Okay. So we've got 3 kind of types of memory that exist. One of those types of memory, if I were to label it, I'm going to label it here as active memory. So when I say active memory, I'm talking about things that are, when you turn on the Kronos, things that are live right now, things that you have access to that you can access in the interface. So to give you an example of some of the kinds of things, those are going to be like programs, combis. That's going to be your global settings. So it's those kinds of things that you're going to find in your active memory. Now there's more. There's going to be wave sequencing. There's going to be things that are technically related to well, not just wave sequencing, but like drum kits. So drum kits aren't edited in program mode, they're edited in global mode, and I'll show you that a little bit as well. So now here's the funny thing about this active memory. When you save the active memory, when you save like your current state or snapshot of your Kronos, how it's set up right now, that active memory is saved. It saves your programs, your combis, your global settings. It's also going to save your wave sequences, your drum kits. It's going to save a lot of that kind of stuff. You'll notice this is PCG, right? So when I say programs, combis, and global, you're actually saving PCG. And so when you save a PCG, you're saving what's in your current active memory right now, your programs, your combis, and that kind of thing. Now, the second part of memory, and this is interesting because this block right here, this active memory is actually subdividable. It can be broken up into even smaller bits. So we could say things like active memory, but we could also break it even further into things like sequencing and karma. So I'm just going to label that quickly. And karma. Okay. So let the poor exposure to MS Paint continue. The sequencing. So this is your sequence data. So because sequence data doesn't always exist, it's not all, meaning like you might turn on your Kronos and not save a song, right? And so this sequencing data is optional, meaning if there's sequencing data, if you've got like song 1 and then you've got song 2 and maybe song 3, which is a big production, and maybe you're, playing with song 4, if there is sequencing data, when you save all, it's going to save that sequencing data as a .seq file. And so this is where the differentiation comes in. When you save what's in your active memory, your programs, globals, combi, and blah, 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 that is going to be saved as a .pcg file. When you save your sampling data, your sequencing data rather, that's going to show up as a .seq file. The karma stuff. Karma, when you save it, now again, Karma has a lot of built-in features and functionality. So if you were to customize Karma, make some sort of modification to a Karma preset, when you save that information, that is going to be saved as, shoot. I'm actually opening up my backup on my Kronos so I can tell you the file format type because it's escaping me at 10:54 a.m. in Canada. I've been on vacation for like almost 2 weeks, and so my brain has been mushified, and I am working on getting it back. So Karma is going to be .kge, which stands for Karma Generated Effects, I believe. So those are the file formats that will show up when you're trying to save something, right? So when you do a save all, it's going to save your PCG, it's going to save your SEQ data if there is any. It'll save KGE, which it just kind of backs up by default. But then there's also other kinds of memory that are also being used. So one of them is going to be your sample memory. And so there's actually two kind of types of sample memory. So this is going to be interesting to explain. So I'm going to do my best. And again, if you have questions, just throw them in the chat. I'm still watching that as well. Actually, so a couple of quick questions just before we continue. So Maddie B's asking, will the PCG Tools application work for other types of workstation keyboards? I understood you wrote keywords, but I'm assuming you mean keyboards. Actually, PCG Tools does work for a variety of keyboards. So you can't necessarily translate from one to another. So you couldn't necessarily take like a Korg M3 keyboard, use PCG Tools and make it work in a Kronos because of how samples and so on are laid out, but you can actually use the PCG Tools to manipulate PCG files from other keyboards. It's not just specifically the Kronos. Okay. And so how did I make the Kyrie bass arpeggiato? I'll show you that. That's easy enough. Okay. Have I ever heard of odors coming from the LCD screen of a Kronos? I can't say that I have. That's a new one for me. Now, also to be entirely fair, I don't go around sniffing my keyboard either. But if it's an odor bad enough that you notice it without intentionally looking for it, I can't say that's something that I've noticed. And I'm wondering if it's actually something underneath the LCD screen of the Kronos that's might have seeped in and it got heated up, and so you can smell it better. I'm not sure. That's a new one to me. Okay, so talking about some of the different memory types. So we've got sample memory, and this is, okay, so actually Dirk's just saying, you said in another video that only 16-bit is possible, but in the new one is 24-bit also possible to load, isn't it? Okay, so yeah, that's a good thing to correct, and that's specific to loading samples. So originally I thought that so what happened was I had 24-bit files that were a different sample rate that wasn't supported, but Kronos can load 16-bit and 24-bit samples. But one of the actual HD1 engine is only 16-bit. When you look at the Korg Oasis, its high synthesis engine, I think it was that, or I forget exactly what it was called, but basically the HD1 engine, the actual engine itself output in 24-bit as opposed to 16-bit for the Kronos. So there was a little bit of confusion there. But yes, you can load both 16-bit and 24-bit files as long as they are the right like kilohertz, like the 44.1 or 48,000 or like that kind of thing. Okay. So looking at the memory, so we've got our active memory, so PCG files, sequences, Karma. Okay. We've got sample memory. And sample memory gets broken down into basically two parts as well. Actually, technically three if you wanted to be pedantic. So I'm going to say this is our sample memory right up top here. And there are three types. So let's grab some more colors. Actually, that's going to be annoying, isn't it? I'll just label them. So our sample memory is going to be broken down into basically you've got what are called user samples, you've got RAM samples, and then you've got expansions. And our expansions are going to be things like if you were to purchase an expansion like the EXS 1718, which is like your Berlin Grand and then famous sound sets and that kind of thing. Those are kind of the kinds of places that you're going to find samples. So I'm just going to write them. One is user sample banks. One, and I'm going to differentiate this slightly and call it RAM banks. These are still actually samples, so I'll call it RAM sample banks. And then finally, expansions. Okay, so let's talk about the difference here. So Lou's saying it's pretty bad. I'm calling the authorized repair store in 10 minutes. Odor's coming up to my face pretty strong. Yeah, that's not necessarily a good thing. Usually smells are bad when it comes to electronics. Birendra, I hope I said that right. Recording audio file in the same audio track after booting next time, even after I delete the data when I try to record the same audio track. It says the file already exists. We might take a look at some of that, depending on how time goes. We're already half an hour in, and I don't have an agenda today. I'm gonna just kind of hang out, and we'll finish when it kind of makes sense to finish. But if we can get to it, we'll definitely take a look. I backed up last night to a flash drive, but the only thing I really want to put back is what I had programmed is the set list. Is that possible? Using PCG Tools, yes. So if you've made a backup, and we talked about it a little bit earlier with PCG Tools, you can move like just set lists around. But when you move set lists around, I won't get into it just yet. I want to try and stay to one topic because I will bounce between topics too easily. So we'll talk about it in a minute. Okay, so our sample memory. When I talk about user sample banks are going to be sample banks that get treated like their own individual sample libraries. So they can be named, and you can often, I'm actually just going to kind of interject this here. So some features of these user sample banks. So they can be named, so you can reference them by name. But they'll also be read-only. And so these user sample banks are read-only, and they show up kind of like this. Okay, so when you see, it's going to be a file name underscore userbank.ksc. And this KSC is a Korg sample collection. And it's basically a script that loads the samples for you. So a KSC, if you were to actually look at it in a text file, like open the KSC up on the computer, you would notice that it's actually like a loading script. It doesn't have the samples itself. It just loads the script that loads all of the samples. RAM sample banks, these are going to be live samples that you are editing now. So I'm going to put some properties here. So these are not named. And when I say it's not named, I mean you can name the samples and you can name the key maps, which is a KMP file. You can name them. So you can do that. But what I mean is you can't reference them by name. When you load a sample bank, like when you load a RAM sample bank, it's going to reference it by the position of the sample. So the sample will be in like position 0000 or 0001, and I can show you what that looks like. So they're not named. They are editable. So you can edit these samples. But they are stored in RAM. Volatile. I'm spelling this wrong, aren't I? Volatile. Okay, so anyway, they're not named, they are editable, but they're stored in RAM, which means they're volatile. If you turn the Kronos off and back on without saving these files, they're gone. So that's something that you need to be aware of. These user sample banks, because they're read-only, they're typically loaded off of a hard drive. And that's actually the third kind of memory, and we'll talk about that. It's like your long-term storage, but generally speaking, a userbank.ksc, you can only load those from a hard drive. You can stream, I mean, technically you can load them from a USB stick but you're better off loading them from a hard drive and streaming them. And so we can talk about that. So RAM sample banks, they're stored in RAM, they are volatile. And they are stored as, like a file name .ksc. And so there is a difference. If you have file name .ksc, when you load it by default, it's going to go into your RAM. It means it's editable. You can make changes to those samples, like things like loop points, start points, end points, volumes, trimming, and so on. Where user sample banks, these are read-only. They're loaded into memory, but they're typically streamed from the hard drive. And you cannot edit them. You would have to load the relative file name.ksc into your RAM, make your changes, and then save it again. And when you do, you get a user bank.ksc out of it, and I'll show you that. And then finally, expansions. So expansions are a little bit different. Expansions, you don't always have access to those samples directly. I mean, you do have access to expansions, but you don't have the ability to edit them. You don't have the ability to even see the original files or the KSC files. In a lot of cases, expansions are going to be installed, and when they are installed, they're installed to the hard drive, and they've got a special kind of access memory that's being used that takes advantage of things like the authorization system or sound protection system in the Kronos that protects it from like samples being ripped and so on. So these are going to typically be like EXSs. And so like EXS, I think 17 and 18, for example, which is going to be your Berlin Grand sample library. So it's the Berlin Grand plus Famous Sounds. And so that's just an example. And the process for getting an expansion installed is very different than it is for loading user samples or RAM samples. So this is kind of your sample memory, and things, when you boot up your Kronos, things go into this sample memory. Now, a common question is, how do I get these to load automatically? And if you wanted them to load automatically, you have to go into global mode, and you're looking for something called auto load. So if you go, like, it's basically global load. There's a KSC auto load tab or auto load page. So let me just show you my Kronos really quickly. So in my Kronos, when I go to global mode, right, and so the different modes are just by your setlist button. So you've got like setlist mode, and so you can see your set list. You can go to combi mode and see things in your combis and program and sequence and so on. So those are the different modes that are available. One of them is global mode, and in global mode, there's a tab here that says KSC auto load. And the KSC auto load is actually where you choose to add KSCs that you want loaded when the Kronos boots. So this is nothing more than the Mac or Windows or Linux equivalent of when your computer starts up, what starts up with it, what gets loaded automatically. And so in this case, the preload is going to be all of your original RAM or ROM samples. And so as part of your sample memory, so looking back at this, part of your sample memory is part of your expansions. So in your expansions, this includes the original ROM, the read-only memory. So I'm going to say there. So technically, your ROM, your read-only memory, is, if you want to be pedantic, it's kind of an expansion that's installed. You don't necessarily have access to edit the samples that are in ROM. That's why it's read-only memory. But you do have access to them, and you can reference them when you're making sounds. And so I can show you a little bit of that too as well. And so these expansions, your ROM, that's all loaded when you first boot up. And this ROM is actually going to be a specific file name. So your preload.pcg file is the PCG that has all of your active memory, your kind of default stuff. So when I say preload PCG, I actually mean preload.ksc. And so if we look at the Kronos here just for a second, here's that preload.ksc that I was talking about. And so this is your preload.korg sample collection. That's why the disk size says it's 21 gigabytes, because it's loading all of the basic ROM. So that's if you have the German Grand, if you have the, like your different grand pianos and so on. If you have, well, your basic ROM itself. So all of your stereo ROM samples, all of your mono ROM samples, all of that stuff is housed inside of this preload.ksc file. So that's why it's so important. And that's why if you were to do something crazy like uncheck this box that says auto load for the preload.ksc, I'll press it 1,000 times and only hit it once here. So auto load. If you turn this off and hit the button that says do auto load now, what's going to happen is it's going to basically clear out all of your RAM samples. It's going to clear out all of the samples that are currently loaded in the Kronos, and it's going to reboot. And when it reboots, the only things that you'll hear are sounds that are EXI based, because they might not reference samples. And so, you know, if you've ever done this, where you've either turned this auto load off or removed the preload.ksc file, a bunch of your sounds won't work. And that's why, because the preload is your base ROM. This is where the fundamentals of all of your sounds are in the Kronos. So lots of different pieces of information here. So the third thing that I wanted to talk about for memory is basically, I'm going to call it long-term memory or long-term storage. And this can also be broken up into multiple parts. So if I were to break it up into part 1 and part 2, it would look like this. You've got internal memory and external memory. So let me write that quickly. And external. So here's what I mean. When I say long-term storage, I'm actually talking about your hard drive. Dirk, I do see your question here. I'll get to it in just a second. So long-term storage, internal is going to be your SSD. So that just stands for solid state drive. There's also what originally we would use for long-term storage are HDDs or hard disk drives. But because they don't stream files fast enough, the Kronos actually has SSDs. That gives you the ability to stream samples from the hard drive directly. And that way you don't need to load them into RAM. It's kind of a way of bypassing it. So inside of your RAM or your random access memory, it's just going to have what's called a stub. It has just like a shortcut. And whenever the shortcut's accessed, it points to the SSD, and the SSD just streams the sample directly to the memory. So it takes up less space. But long story short, your internal memory is your SSD. This is where all of your files are stored. So this is where you look at the file system. This is where you're going to see things like your PCG files or your KSC files. This is where you're going to see things like folders, where you put your backups. This is your long-term storage. Your external is going to be the exact same thing, but typically these are going to be USB sticks, right? So these are going to be USB sticks or external hard drives that plug in via USB. So they're USB. You cannot stream. There. So you can't stream, meaning you can't do hard drive streaming. So if you load samples from your external USB stick and you try and stream them, it's not going to work. It's just not fast enough, right? But you can still copy files and you move folders and so on. So generally speaking, the way you access these different things, this long-term storage, the way you access it is disk mode, right? So when you go into disk mode in the Kronos, you're accessing your long-term storage. So if I were to jump over to my Kronos and I go to disk mode, I am accessing my long-term storage. I'm accessing my internal HD. So HDD internal HD, that means hard disk drive internal HD. This actually, if we wanted to be really, really picky, should say SSD. It should say solid state drive, but okay, fine. And when you hit the little drop down, if you've got more than one internal hard drive connected, it'll show up here. You'll also see RDD, which stands for removable disk drive. I don't have any plugged in my USB port at the moment because I use FTP. I use file transferring via Ethernet. So I do file transfers a little bit differently than most people. But when you plug in a removable disk drive, it'll show up here as RDD, and that's where your files are. So when people are loading samples, this is where things get confusing, because when they'll load samples, they don't necessarily realize if they're trying to load it from a USB stick, they don't know that you have to either move it to the hard drive and then load the samples into RAM. That way the RAM samples are pointing to the hard drive. Because if you try and edit the samples directly from your USB stick, it will load them into RAM, but until you save it to your local SSD, it's not necessarily going to be able to use them properly. So this is why it's kind of important to understand some of the different aspects of memory in terms of the Kronos. And this is not really explained anywhere unless you get into the technical manuals and you kind of read through and see, okay, where is the memory stored, or why is it put there, and that kind of thing. So yeah, well, it is what it is. It's complicated because it's a powerhouse of a workstation, and unfortunately, it leads to complications like this, where you need to know all kinds of different aspects of the memory. So that is a very, very long explanation as to the memory layout on the Kronos, but that's generally speaking how it's set up. And I mean, yes, we could tear each one of these apart and get into them in more detail, but generally speaking, this is what it kind of looks like. Okay, so let's take a look at some questions. How are we going? So KSF and KMP. Okay, so this is going back to Presley's question, kind of having trouble with KSF and KMP files, transferring, saving, and opening. Okay, so to talk about those file types, keep in mind that we are actually talking about these files here, the sample memory stuff, right? So you'll have them stored somewhere. So when you're talking about KSF and KMP files, you're talking about Korg sample format and Korg multi-sample KMP, multi-sample something. I don't actually know what that stands for. But we have multi-samples and we have the individual samples themselves. So things like a sample is going to contain things like loop points and volume and so on, where a key map is going to have a list of what samples comprise the key map. And I'll show you what that kind of looks like in a second. So when you're working with samples, the guideline that I tend to follow is I edit the samples in RAM, and then I save them in the hard drive, in the SSD, and then when I want to use them, I load the user bank KSC. And so the RAM is our actual RAM. The user bank KSC tends to be streamed directly from the SSD, and so it saves space. It relies on the space in the SSD to load your user banks. So when we're talking about things like KMP files or the KG, those other files here, let me actually load. I'm going to open up my sample library. And if I look inside, so I'm looking at two files here. I'm looking at my KSC file, my user bank KSC file, and here's my master library that actually contains those samples that that Presley was mentioning. These are loading scripts, right? Notice how small they are. You can't store, I mean, I suppose you could store some samples in 37K of memory or 137 or 176. It's not a lot of memory, but when you actually hit open, so this is something that you can do pretty much in the Kronos just about everywhere, is instead of hitting the load button to load the samples, you can hit open instead. And that'll show you what's inside the contents of the file. So inside my user bank KSC, it has a folder. When I hit open, it's going to show me my multi-samples and my drum samples. Well, I've got a bunch of multi-samples that I use. When I hit open, suddenly I can see all of my multi-samples that are currently loaded in that file. So these are going to be things that I use for either bands that I work with or like that kind of thing, things that I've been playing with recently. So here's my kind of sample collection. When you load a KSC file, it loads all of these. It's just a script. That's all it does, is it runs the script and it loads all of that stuff. So if you're not sure, you can always hit up. Now, this KSC, master library KSC, that will load it into RAM. So if I were to load that file, it's going to load it into my RAM. Okay, so this is live. It's not named, it is editable, and it's stored in your volatile memory. Okay. If I were to load the userbank.ksc, this userbank.ksc file, when I load that file, it's going to load that information into my user sample banks. Now, when it loads, it's typically, I mean, you do get the option to load it into RAM if you want to as well, but most people are just typically going to leave this loading style default. And when you load it, it will stream from the internal SSD. So it takes up a whole lot less space, but that's why they're read-only. They're read-only because you're not able to edit the files that are being streamed from the hard drive. You'd have to load it into RAM, where it loads the whole sample. You do your editing, and then you save it back to the hard drive, right? So if I were to load a userbank.ksc file, it's basically going to load a stub into memory and then point to it. And so when if I were to load this userbank.ksc file, I can't edit it, but I can still use the samples as though they were an expansion. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. And then finally, in here, this is where the actual sample content itself is, right? So this is why it's so important to keep these 3 files together when you're loading samples, because they are dependent on the file path. If we were to rename this master-library to something else, these scripts won't be able to find the samples. It simply can't find them because they are simply scripts. They're just looking for a folder path. And if that folder library name is different, it can't find them. So I'm going to go ahead and open that folder. And when you do, you'll notice that each multi-sample gets its own folder, right? It actually technically gets 2. And one's your left sample and one's your right sample. So they're typically like, this one's 24 karat magic something. And so you've got samples in stereo that are left and right, but you can usually edit them in pairs. So when you're doing your editing, it'll open up both. It's smart enough to know that they're stereo, which is where you see things like this. So it could be that they're mono, it could be that they're stereo, but they'll know what to do. And these KSF files, these are the actual samples themselves. So if I were to, you'll notice I don't get the option to open them any further, but I can hit load. And when I hit load, it's going to ask me, okay, well, what do we want to load it as? Well, we're loading this KSF file, so I'm going to hit OK. And when I do, if I go to my sampling mode, in sampling mode, of course, it's not going to do it this time, is it? Yeah, here it is. Okay, so in sampling mode, I've got my key map, and down here I have my sample itself. When I tap on the sample, here is the sample that I just loaded. It's an individual sample. There, so that's all it is. So that's the whole sample. But this is how I get it into RAM. So right now, this is actually loaded into my RAM sample bank. It's editable. I can play with it. Yes, I can rename it. It's not referenced by name, but I can rename it. And I can make changes to it. And so this is where I can do things like edit the loop. So if I wanted to loop it differently, I can. Or if I wanted to have a repeat, or if maybe I don't want it as loud as it is. There we go. I can add 12 decibels to it to make it louder. I can use 0 and loop lock. And this is for like creating loops and stuff like that. I can enable my grid. And so I can make changes to the sample here. This is all well and good, but then you need to save it somewhere, right? Once you're done with it, you need to save your sample you could save it as an individual sample, but in most cases, people are going to go back to disk mode and they're going to try and save their current samples. So I'm just going to go up, 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 and I'm going to go to the Save tab, and when I do, I can say Save Sampling Data. And from here, this is where you can do things like save your samples. So you can save it as a name. So I'm just going to say name, just so we have something put in here. And when I'm talking about these different pieces, when I'm talking about things like sampling mode data, this is going to be the sampling mode that is currently in RAM right now. So this is the sampling mode that we were just in editing the sample. Now you can also add links to EXIs and user sample banks. So these are just the links. These are just references. Most cases you're going to want to use this if you've got samples that you've just created. But sometimes maybe you have samples that are referencing expansions. So maybe you're using a sample from an expansion. You might need to reference it there. And that's how you can tell when you go to load a sample. Sometimes at the bottom it says unable to complete due to EXI missing or something, I forget. It's in red text, but it basically says that you can't load the sample because an expansion is missing. Well, when you choose this option, it's going to say, well, use any expansions that are currently installed. We want to reference them. And then this one is both your sampling mode data and the links. So these are just the shortcuts. This is both. I don't necessarily recommend using both sampling mode and links unless you use expansion samples in your sample library. Otherwise, if you're making all of your own samples, just use this option. It makes things a lot more tidy when you're loading and cleaning samples and that kind of thing. And then down here, your sampling mode data options. So we can say all multi-samples. We can say just the samples. So we don't want the multi-samples or your key maps. You could say we want the multi-samples. I tend to just say all. I would rather save too much than not enough, because these hard drives are quite large. Like, and they're easy to swap out as well. So if you wanted to go from like a 30 gig hard drive that's in the original Kronos to like a 256 gigabyte solid state drive, you can do that fairly easily. It's it's definitely doable. So there's lots and lots of space. I would rather use that space and include everything that I want. And just keep in mind, when you choose these different options, it clears out the name again. So once you're done, I'm just going to choose name again here. I'll delete this file later, but I'm going to say OK. And what I've done is when I hit OK, there, it's going to create 3 files. So here's the first file. This is the folder that contains all of my multi-samples. This is the script for loading stuff into RAM. This is the script for loading stuff as a shortcut. And so again, when we go back to this screen, if we load it as RAM, it's editable. If we load it as a userbank.ksc, it's read-only, but we can reference it by name. So this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about when it's like when you're trying to understand samples. It can be really confusing. If you don't understand the memory, you don't know where the RAMs or the memory, the sounds are being loaded. And then if you don't know where they're being loaded, when you hit save, you don't know where you're saving it to and how to reference it. And there's a lot to it. So I totally get why it can be ridiculously confusing. Presley, I hope that kind of helps answer some of your question. Let's see what else we've got. Okay, so there's a lot of other stuff here. Okay, so how about virtual memory? Oh, thanks, Abraham. Appreciate that. What's the difference between write and save? Can I modify an existing KSC? Okay, so let me talk about that for a second here. Jadasbo is asking, who or what companies will competently upgrade your Kronos SSD? That's a very good question. I do all of my own work. So outside of my music job with Adora, I work as IT. And so when it comes to computers and computer programming and that kind of thing, I do everything myself. So I build my own computers. When it comes to the Kronos, they are just computers. They're running Linux. They are literally just computers. And so when you open one up on the inside, it is a D525 Intel-based Atom motherboard. And so when it comes to the Kronos SSD upgrade, I did it myself. And I just used the original install disks to rewrite. But you can do crazy things like boot into Linux, and then you can do an image file copy where it copies the Kronos image from one hard drive to another, and then you can manually expand the space and so on. So in terms of companies that can do that, I do not have a good answer for you. I'm afraid I don't know. I would say like there's enough guides if you go to the Kronos forums that can show you how to do it yourself. It's not as scary as it sounds, as long as you understand that, as long as you've got a backup of everything. You can't break it so bad typically that you can't get it back without the Kronos restore disks, right? Like it can be fixed, it can be made to work. But yeah, so if you're not super comfortable, I don't know of any companies that would do that for you. Okay, so talking about some other questions. Let me see here. We talked about that. I'm just going through the chat really quickly here. 16, 24-bit, we talked about that. Recording audio file in the same track. Okay, so let me see if I can better understand this question. So is it Biendra? Recording audio file in the same audio track after booting. Next time, even after I delete the data, when I try to record in the same audio track, it says the file already exists. I'm wondering if what's happening is when you're loading or saving files, I'm wondering if you're saving it to disk mode potentially and the file's already there. Because when you load samples into the RAM sample memory, what's going to happen is that this RAM sample data isn't named. It's basically put in a storage slot. And so you can have the same name over and over and over. This is why they're not named samples, right? I mean, you can name them. Again, this is a human readable naming convention. They're not referenced by name when you load them. So with these RAM samples, it should be stored here. So when you're loading a sample, this is where it should go. It's when you go to save it that it's going to probably have the same name. So by default, it's just called newfile.ksc. And so if you're trying to load the same file over and over, or you're trying to give it the same name when you're going into disk mode and hitting save, it's going to say newfile.ksc. That's going to be kind of the default. So yeah, when you go save in the drop down here and you go say save sampling data, this name, if it's already being used, you can choose to overwrite it or whatever the case may be. I may be completely misunderstanding your question though, so if you just wanted to let me know, I'd appreciate that. Let me see here. Dirk Hoffman. So it says sometimes save as a wildcard. What does that mean? So generally speaking, in computer land, a wildcard... Now, wildcards are going to be something that you find more with searching than with saving. The only reason I say that is because when you copy something, you can do what's called a wildcard search. And a wildcard search simply means when you do a search, a field like an asterisk will represent a whole bunch of characters. So if you're doing a search for something, that makes sense. When you're loading something or if you're renaming something, you can often do a wildcard where you're representing a whole bunch of things with a single character. Now, in this case, when I'm looking at something like saving, I don't have the ability to save, right? Like if I go save all, I don't get a wildcard ability to save, because when you're saving to the hard drive, when you're saving to the internal memory, it needs something very specific. Thank you, Presley. I hugely appreciate that, man. That's great. Yeah, so when it comes to wildcards, so a wildcard is just that single character that represents, it could be a whole bunch of things. And so when it comes to saving, your saving needs to be really precise, because you can't just store like a wildcarded file name as part of the file system. So I'm wondering where you're seeing like the wildcard aspect of things. So if you know off the top of your head, let me know and I'll see what I can make sense for you. Okay. How about virtual memory? Okay, so Gur, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing it. I'm just going to say it all kinds of ways. Virtual memory. When it's talking about virtual memory, the virtual memory, when we're going back to this memory stuff, virtual memory is the links that's being referenced. So the way the virtual memory works is these are these kind of shortcuts, right? So in RAM, these samples are going to be the actual samples themselves. Sample memory, when things are loaded virtually, this is what they're talking about, is that this user sample bank is basically your virtual memory. What happens is anytime the Kronos operating system says, I need a sample, right? So you go to press a key and a sample is being referenced. What happens is instead of the whole sample being loaded into memory, what happens is a reference is made to the SSD. And this link right here, that is your virtual memory. So when we look at the Kronos itself and we go into global mode and this KSC auto load, this is what we're talking about with virtual memory and RAM. Okay. So the disk size is 21 gigabytes. That means we've got 21 gigabytes worth of samples that would get loaded with the preload. Well, here's the fun thing. When I try and choose RAM, it's going to take up 18 gigs of RAM. Well, I don't have 18 gigs. I've only got 4, right? Well, it says 3.0 gigs here because of a memory restraint and 32-bit and Linux and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, I don't have enough RAM. I can't do it. So we can choose virtual memory. And what virtual memory does, if we go back to my terrible MS Paint drawing, we've got user bank KSC. These are the links, the kind of the stubs or the shortcuts that reference the actual files on the SSD. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about virtual memory. If we were to take this and go like this, well, this is something totally different, because this RAM is being stored in the physical RAM itself. It's actually in the RAM chips on the drive. They're accessible right away, and in fact, we don't need these stubs anymore. They just exist in RAM. But when we do this, and we move it into user sample banks, this is virtual memory. And this is why it takes up less space, because we only need the references and the stubs that allow the SSD to see, or rather allow the operating system to see where on the hard drive the samples are stored so it can stream them. So that's kind of what we're talking about when we see like this virtual memory versus RAM. And so when we talk about KSC settings, the KSC settings just means load it from whatever the KSC file says to load. So again, if this KSC file is a loading script, then the only thing it's really meant for is just loading samples, and you get to choose how those samples are loaded by this setting. So that's kind of what that means. Okay. Dirk was asking, what's the difference between write and save? Well, generally speaking, they are kind of the same thing. Now, you might find, yeah, not a problem. You might find write versus overwrite versus save. And so the big difference here is when you go to save something. So if I go to my save menu, actually I'm in the wrong folder. Here we go. So if I go to my save menu and I go to save sampling data, well, I'm going to get this option here that I could say overwrite. Well, writing and saving are technically the exact same thing. If you wanted to be really specific, a save is a net new file on an operating system file, so like folder structure, versus an overwrite or technically a write. A write is going to be writing to a file. An overwrite is going to be overwriting an existing file. So when you hit save, you're saving a net new file. When you're writing, technically you're going to be overwriting. An overwrite is when you write to an existing file that already is there. And generally speaking, when you overwrite a system file, not a system file, but overwrite a file, what it actually does is it just deletes the file and then resaves it. So the difference between a save and an overwrite is just, is there already a file there or not? So it's really a naming convention. There's no real technology difference in terms of what it's doing. Roberto, you are asking, can I modify an existing KSC? This is an excellent question, and the reason I'm going to say it's an excellent question is because it gives me a chance to talk a little bit more about this stuff. Actually, I don't want to belabor too much on the memory, but it is important to understand. So when it comes to modifying an existing KSC, the answer here is generally yes, provided it's not in here somewhere. So you cannot, you cannot edit or change existing ROMs. You can reference them, you can use them, but you can't edit them. Same thing is technically true with user sample banks. They are read-only. You cannot edit them. That being said, generally speaking, you should be able to load KSC files into RAM. So I'm just going to get rid of these X's here. So you can load files into RAM where they can become editable, right? This sample memory, when it's loaded, is where it's really important, right? So it's, what are you trying to do with the file? So let me go to my Kronos and I'll show you what I'm talking about here. Hopefully I can better illustrate. Anytime you load a KSC file or a user bank KSC file, those files are going to be stored in a specific part of memory. And that's why I'm kind of talking about this memory aspect of things so much. But if you wanted to edit a KSC file, so let's say you've got a user bank KSC file. Usually, user bank KSCs are dependent on the KSC file as well. So they should come in a pair. Actually, it's a trio of files that you're going to see when you look at samples. So if I go to my master sample library, there's going to be 3 files. There's going to be the folder, which you can see because it has no size, and it is the icon of a folder. When you click on the folder itself is going to contain all of your samples and so on. This sample loading script, this master-library.ksc, that's going to load it into RAM. And this is where you can do your editing. This one is going to be where you do your playback. This is where you can load it into virtual memory, and this is where you can reference it. Also, when you go to global mode and you choose to add a KSC, so I'm going to say add KSC, I can choose, here we go, I can go to my master sample library and say open, and I can say I want to load my userbank.ksc. So when I boot up my Kronos, I want to reference these samples. I don't necessarily want to be able to edit them every time, right? If I wanted to edit them every single time, I would load this, and this is going to load it into RAM. Now, there's a disadvantage of doing that. You can do this, but this actually caught me up pretty good when I first started working with the Kronos and I didn't understand the kind of memory types. If you were to load a KSC, that gets loaded into your RAM, right? So let me go back just quickly here. When you load a KSC file, it gets loaded into your RAM. Now the problem is that you can only load one KSC file into RAM at a time. Now that's not to say that you can't have multiple sets of samples loaded, but when you load a KSC file, it loads a script, and that script will load stuff into your RAM. Well, if you were to load 3 scripts, it's going to run 3 scripts one at a time, and each one is going to overwrite the other one. So what will happen is if I were to load this, master library.ksc, it's going to load it into RAM. If I were to add another KSC that also referenced not a user bank, but just a regular KSC file, if I were to load that again, it's going to overwrite this existing one and it's going to load the next one instead, right? So what's going to happen is it's going to completely overwrite what's in your RAM over and over and over. So if you have like a list of 10 of them, it can't load them concurrently. It loads them back to back. So what you do instead is when you go to disk mode, you load the user bank KSC, and this user bank can load multiple different user banks at the same time. And this is what I was talking about by like a named reference versus an unnamed reference. And so here, this is where we can say, okay, I could load this userbank.ksc when I go into global mode. I'm going to remove this one because we don't want this master library one. That's going to load into RAM. We don't want that. I'm going to add my userbank version. And actually just something that's really interesting here. This is why our disk size versus our RAM size is different. We've got 526 megabytes of samples on the disk, but it's only going to take up 101 megabytes worth of space in terms of shortcuts in the RAM. So this is why those memory sizes are different. Now again, I could choose to load this directly into RAM, and when I do, this is going to jump up to 526 because it's storing the whole thing in RAM. So to answer your question, this is the kind of the long explanation here. But Roberto, to answer your question, can you modify an existing KSC? The answer is yes. One of the things that you need to do, I'm just waiting for my Kronos. There we go. One of the things that you need to do is you need to load the KSC into your RAM. This is where you edit them. Once you're done editing them, you want to save them onto your disk on the Kronos as, well, in this case, you're going to save it as a file or a file set. And you do that by going to save, the drop down and under the top, and then say save sampling data. And when you save the sampling data, again, this is where I tend to reference the sampling mode data because this is the samples that you were just editing. And I would typically say all. And when you hit OK, it's going to save all of your samples. Now I just used the word name, so it added these here. But you're going to have these 3 files that show up. And so when you want to edit stuff, load the KSC file. When you're done with it, just save it, and it's going to rename, or it's going to save on top of your existing sample library. And when you make those changes, those samples are going to then be under the userbank.ksc as well when you go to load it. So it's a convoluted process, but it does kind of make sense once you start to understand kind of how the memory is laid out and where things get saved. Okay, so Jadaspo, who or what companies? Well, oh yeah, we talked about that. Okay. Ed is asking, hi Dave, have you tried making round robin samples using the wave station feature? I played with it a bit a few months ago. Would be great for multi-sampling with velocity layers and round robins. Okay. Ed, I have to say, I actually haven't tried using round robin samples using the wave station. You'll have to enlighten me, because when it comes to the wave station, so this is just for everybody that's watching and isn't quite sure what we're talking about here. The Korg wave station, it's part of the sample playback ability is you can load in the HD1 engine instead of using regular ROM files. So let me go to the HD1 engine bank. Let me see if I can find one here. That's empty. I think my user GG has some here. Okay, so I'm grabbing an init program. So in this initialized program, under your oscillator tab or under your oscillator page, this is where we can choose to use samples, right? Now, one of the things that you have the ability to select is W sequence or wave sequence. And in your wave sequence, you've got a whole bunch of initialized wave sequences that exist. So you can edit these, and I'll show you where you do this. But these are pre-built ones. Okay, so I'm just holding a single key. But you can look at different ones here. Okay. Okay, so this is neat because it's doing a little bit of a morph here. Okay, so what a wave sequence is, or what it allows you to do as part of the wave sequencing functionality built into the Kronos, is that you can morph from one waveform into another. You can play them back to back to make it kind of percussive. And where you do the editing is actually under global mode. So when you go to global mode, you're going to have this option here under wave sequence. Now, because wave sequences, and the reason, so this is a little bit confusing. Some people ask, well, why is wave sequence put under global mode? Well, because a wave sequence is a global function. It's something that's accessed from a program. So we're not going to go into program mode to do the editing of a wave sequence, because there's no functionality built in program mode that allows you to edit a wave sequence, because a wave sequence is kind of a global property. Same thing with a drum kit. So when you go to global mode, you're going to have access to things like wave sequences and drum kits. So there was a question earlier about how do you edit drum kits. Well, this is where you would go to edit a drum kit. And a drum kit is going to have all these different kind of, like you're on your keyboard. Those are just sample assignments. And so you could choose an individual key and say, okay, well, this particular key here, this D#3, these are velocity layers. So when you're playing like a certain velocity, it's going to trigger a certain sample or a set of samples. Okay. And so for this particular key, we have assigned these waveforms basically to this one key. And then this is going to give you the ability to manipulate things like, okay, well, how hard do you have to press before that sample is triggered and that kind of thing. And you get up to 8 velocity layers. So that's the drum kit. With wave sequencing, you're basically doing the same idea where you're taking a key map of a particular sound or set of sounds and you're spreading it across the keyboard. And so this wave sequence, if I were to grab a totally blank wave sequence, I'm just going to go to the very end of my list. Here we go. So this is a brand new wave sequence. It's just a bunch of piano, right? Well, this is a great way that you can do a couple of different things. One of the things that you can do is you can create patterns here. So somebody was asking about, like, how do you do the Kyrie bass intro? Well, there's a bunch of different ways. So the Kronos actually has, I mean, it's got karma, it's got step sequencing, it's got wave sequencing. You can do it technically through a sequence. It's got something called RPPR, which is pattern recording. You've got a bunch of different ways that you could make that happen. And so it's really entirely up to you in terms of how you want to do that. One of the ways that you could do it, though, is by using a wave sequence. And so I'll just kind of show you the way this works. when you're looking at an initialized wave sequence, you've got parameters like time and tempo. So how are we setting this up? So if you set it on time, it's going to be based off of, a regular clock. If you've got tempo, it's based off of whatever the current tempo is on the Kronos. Now, it just so happens that the time and tempo are matching, right? So they're kind of at default state. So this is 120 BPM, or 2 beats per every second, right? Okay. So you've got the run button, and what that does is that actually runs the wave sequencer. If this runs off, if the run button is off, it's just going to play it once, right? But if you were to tap run, it's going to continue to play it over and over. And so we've got things like steps. So how many steps are we doing? So you could say, well, I want 4 steps. And the wave sequence itself is going to be, okay, where does the step sequence start? Where does it end? How long is it? And this is just kind of automatically figured out based off of the start and end, right? So this is a read-only field. You've got AMS. AMS is your alternate modulation source, and this gives you the ability to change things like your start and end points based off of something like aftertouch. Or you could change it based off of things like LFO, like your common LFO. You could change it off of things like your velocity. So maybe when you play harder or softer, it's going to change where the sequence actually starts and stops. So you can make changes like that using your AMS. And then your intensity is like, well, how many steps? How much is it changing based off of the velocity? So I might say, well, I only want it to adjust like maybe 2 or 3. I want it to shift. I want it to do something like that. You also have your loop start and stop. And this is your start step and your end step. So where does the loop start and where does it stop? And generally speaking, what's going to happen is it's going to start and it will go through until it hits this start step. Once it hits the start step, so let's say our start step was 25. It's going to play 1 through 24. When it hits 25, it's going to trigger the start. Now it'll continue past 25 until it gets to the end, whatever that end is. So if we were to make that 25, and let's make this 29. Actually, it probably won't work because this one was too low, 25. There we go. You'll notice it changes color up top here. So we've got the actual loop, and we've got the loop restart here. The loop would trigger until it hits the beginning, then it goes through it once, and then it's going to loop this section over and over and over and over. Now, we can change that. Now, the repeat times is, well, how many times does it do that? And so you can do up to 127 because it's a MIDI value that can be manipulated. You could say, I only want it to repeat twice. Maybe you want it to repeat 10 times and then it stops, right? So you get that kind of flexibility there. Or you can say 0, which turns it off. Or you can scroll all the way up and that says infinite. So it's just going to repeat forever. You can also choose the direction. So forwards. So does it just go to the end and then start again and go to the end and start again? Does it go backwards and forwards? So does it go to the end and then go backwards and then forwards and it's like a bouncy ball that just goes back and forth? Or does it go backwards? Does it go to the very end and instead of starting again, does it go to the very end and then play backwards and then loop to the end and then play backwards, loop to the end and play backwards? So you can kind of continue doing that. So I'm going to leave it as forwards. So we've got AMS velocity, that's fine. Then under modulation, this is going to be how do we modulate the wave sequence. So Dirk was just saying, do we have to say when you did this already in another video because you did about the wave sequencing? I'm not sure that I understand the question entirely. It's still fairly early for me. I've been on vacation, so let me, if you can re-ask it maybe a little bit different, or maybe I'm just not understanding. So do we have to say when you did this already in another video? Yeah, if you're able to re-ask the question maybe slightly, I'll see what I can do to answer it better. Okay, so with the modulation, we're just modulating either the position or the duration. So this is kind of what we mean with these fields here. So when we're looking at like the wave sequence header, this means that everything in this field, and this is maybe something that not everybody's aware of, when you look at a header, it's telling you what the details are within that header. So in this case, modulation, if we modulate the position, we're modulating the position where the steps start and stop, or the duration, which is like how long does it last for. And so we can use a modulation source to change that. So we could technically use something like joystick plus Y, let's say this one. So if we were to do joystick plus Y, in the intensity, I can actually have it set that when my joystick moves up, it actually decreases, or it sets the intensity to a certain amount. So what's happening is as soon as I move the joystick up, the intensity drops less than 100, and it's just it's cutting off entirely. Interesting. So we can also modulate things like the position and move things around. So the idea here is that we have a bunch of steps that we can control the behavior of. After that, we also have the step parameters. And see, these are the individual steps themselves. So these are like, if you almost wanted to think of it, if you think of the sequence parameter as like combi mode, this is where you set up like, how does it look? How does it work? How does it behave? And then the step parameter is where you actually change each individual step, right? And so here, these are our multi-samples. These are our samples that we're currently using. This is why it plays the same piano tone over and over and over. So we could change it so that instead of playing the piano, I could change it from, ROM M. I could choose, maybe I want one of my own samples that I wanted to reference. Maybe I wanted to use one of the Berlin grand piano samples. Or in a lot of cases, you're probably just going to use ROM M, which is ROM mono. Right here. So I'm going to say ROM mono, and this is where the majority of your sounds are. So when you hit the list, it's going to give you like a categorization. I'm going to go to Wave Station, and I'm going to choose, I don't know, a harmonic. And then I'm going to go to here. I don't want it in EXS. I want ROM mono. And I'm just choosing kind of random sounds here. So I'm going to choose sine, and then, I don't know, something totally different here. Noise. There. Okay, so things are behaving peculiarly because I have like different wave loop starts and stops and all this kind of stuff. So I'm going to turn that all off just so it kind of behaves the way I expect it to. Okay. And I've got this velocity set, so I'll turn that off. Okay. Okay, so what was happening is my modulation source, I had that set to velocity, and I had it to add steps. So what was happening is it was adding steps and then running out of the sample, or running out of the loop points. So that's why it would stop playing. So what I did is I've got my loop start, loop end for 4, and my wave sequence is just 4 steps long. And so now when I go back to my step parameter, we can play through these 4 steps. Right, so that's what it's doing there. Okay. We can also do things like transpose. So we can play the samples. We could do things like play the sample backwards. Right, so it's reversing one of the samples. So maybe we want this noise one. Actually, let's play them all backwards. So it's making them all fairly cut off there. Okay. So you can do things like that, but you can transpose it. So maybe if you're running a bass sequence, right? Maybe you've got a bass sound that will work, right? So let's just choose a simple bass sound. Let me see here. Yeah, electric bass. We'll just do electric bass finger 1. And this one is 315. Okay. So now what happens is when I play a note, so it's playing the same one over and over, right? Well, what you could do is you could say, well, I want it to be a specific pattern. So I'm actually going to transpose this up a third. Okay, actually, let's do it like this. So now I've got a running bass. It's a very simple, very simple pattern, but right? So you can do that kind of thing. And so this is one way that you could make like a very simple pattern. Now, the problem is that you're kind of stuck with the sounds that are currently loaded in ROM, right? So this is just kind of the sounds that you have in here. If you've got a really specific sound that you're trying to get into a pattern, you may not necessarily be able to use wave sequencing for it, because maybe the sound itself has a particular characteristic or that kind of thing. But this is a nice and easy way if you just wanted to get a quick loop, right? Here's another example. I'll use the Kyrie, the Kyrie song. Let me just show you really quickly. Here, Kyrie starts like this. Okay. Okay, so that's the opening sound, right? Well, there's a very specific sound that it's using, but if you wanted to kind of get away with something that would work well enough, it's a 5-note pattern, and under the step parameter, what I'm going to choose is I'm going to try and find a sound that's kind of similar. And in this case, I'm thinking a sine wave is going to be perfect. Now, the thing about the sine wave is that it fades in and out really fast. So if you were to listen to the original song, it's not like a straight click. It's actually like a y. Like that's kind of the ADSR, is that it fades in, right? So 1146, 1146. Okay, so I just happen to know exactly with that song how it's transposed and what the notes are. So I'm just going to get that basic pattern by holding a single key. So that's the pattern, right? If I were to play it manually. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the Kronos to do that pattern for me. So that's the pattern. It's, you know, +8, or well, technically it's an octave. If this is my root note, there's a couple of different ways you can approach it. Like the song is I think it starts in C, right? Anyway, so you could approach it such that I want C to be the note that I press. Well, how do I get this out of pressing a single note C? Well, the way we would do this is the very first note, if we're pressing the C, so this is the root note that we're going to start with, the G, so this first G is going to be, you know, 5 semitones up, which means it's +7. So when we go to transpose, we go 7. So when I press this C, notice how it faded. We'll fix that fading in a minute, but you'll notice, right? So it just faded from, oh, that's because I'm on, okay. See what happened up here? My wave sequence is under PW2. I'm using a kind of a preset here. Let me go back to something that's not that. There, so we're back to default. So I'm just going to quickly adjust this. Okay, so here we go. Step parameter. Okay, so I'm going to go, what was it, 1146, I think. There we go. Okay. So we've got, okay, a bunch of saw, right? Or a sine rather. So the first note was +7. The second one, when I played it comparatively to the C, it goes to the G below, which is -5. It's -5 semitones down. the next note. So it goes na, na, na. So that's the next note is C. So I don't need to change that one. Da, 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 da. So the next note is 2 semitones up because it's the D, and then it goes back to the G down below, which is -5. So if I've -5. So if I've done this right, when I play this, okay, so that's the pattern, but the sound isn't quite right. So what we can do is we can start playing with things like the duration. Well, if I'm going to make it tempo-based, which actually makes more sense for this song, I'm just going to increase the tempo here. I think that's it's a little bit faster than that, I think. Okay, let's pretend that's the right speed. What we can do is we can start kind of massaging things like the crossfade. So does it crossfade from one sample into another? Does it fade from one sample into another? We could also do things like insert spaces so we can make it staccato. So we can actually do things like this. We could change it to end step is 10 instead of 5. And what I'm doing here is I'm going to add a bunch of spaces. Okay, so what we're basically doing is we'll leave the tempo the same, and here's what's going to happen. Right, for the next 5 things that I just added, they're all acoustic piano. So what I can do is I can actually have we'll have to spread this out so that +7 stays where it is, but this next field that's -5, this sign, is actually just going to be blank. So what I can do is I can say I want to tie, or I can say rest. So don't play that next note. We'll take up the space of the note, and that duration is going to be an 8th note, but we're not going to play that note. So it's going to actually skip it. Okay, so let me fix this pattern really quickly here. So that's -5, and then I'm going to go rest, and then that was 0, and then this one is a rest, and then this is 1146 for the sound. Okay, so that's +2, and then a rest. If we scroll down, the last note, that's 1146 as well, for that's our sine. And this one was -5 again, and then this one is a rest. There. So what I've just done is I've basically increased a bunch of spaces, and you can see as I was changing it, it's changing it up top to show you the wave sequence. So now when I play the pattern, it's going to be staccato. But here's a problem. It's playing at half the speed, right? Because I'm increasing, I haven't changed these to 8th notes or to 16th notes. So the duration is currently the same at 206 BPM. So what we can do is we can just hit divide by 2. When we say ×2, we're increasing the duration. So in this case, I wanted to decrease the duration. Okay, so that's kind of getting there. But what we can do is we can start doing things like crossfading and that kind of stuff. Or we could maybe tie things together. So instead of using a rest, we could use a tie. Right, so you could say tie. And this is where you get the ability to make really interesting rhythmic patterns. So if you wanted to use drum kits, or a perfect example would be the opening for Pink Floyd's Money, where it has like the cash register sound, like the money dropping on the counter, like those 7 samples that it repeats in a 7 loop. You could have each one of the samples individually like kind of set up, and that way if your band tends to play that song at a different tempo, you can adjust the tempo on the fly by having the samples assigned to each one of the steps, and when you change the tempo, it'll change the playback, so you're not necessarily locked into an exact speed that you're playing your samples back at. Okay, so that's, hang on a second, let me see here. Dirk, I'm just grabbing that the YouTube link that you had just sent, and I'm just curious here. What, if this is me, what did I say? 3 millisecond crossfade. Okay. You're going to hear me talking about a video that I'm watching. Now, remember how I had said earlier that the crossfade happens at the end of the sample? Well, yeah, okay. So, in terms of, let me see here. I just want to make sure I understand. So, you did this already in another video. You did this already in another video because you did about the wave sequencing. Okay, so I did talk about wave sequencing in another video. So velocity layers and round robins. Okay. When it comes to, so velocity layers. So the thing that's interesting about step sequencing is in terms of velocity layers, you basically treat a step sequence like it is its own key map, right? And so when you go, I'm just going to save this quickly as a test here. So write wave sequence, and I'm just going to call this test. There. So what happens in program mode when you have a wave sequence? The velocity switching happens in the program. So it's the program itself that says, okay, at a certain velocity, trigger this one wave sequence. And we could say we want it from velocity 1. So this is your bottom velocity. And we want it to be linear. And I'm going to add a second wave sequence. And this is going to be the one that we just created here, our test wave sequence. You get to choose kind of what the crossover range is and what the crossover type is. And so here, we could say we want it to be power, so it fades heavily between them. And so when we're talking about like this thing here, this is just the curve of which one, well, it's hard to explain without getting into a graph or a picture. But basically, it kind of looks like this. Let me go back to here. I don't want to save that necessarily. Let's go new, though. Yeah, okay, fine, I'll save it. It can stay that way. Okay. So, when we're talking about crossover curves, and this is something that's fairly typical within audio stuff, generally speaking, you have a curve or a like a curve shape. And typically it's going to look like this. It's like a graph that goes this way. So you've got your X and Y axis. Well, technically it's Y and X axis. But what these two things represent is going to be your two sounds. So this will be like sound 1. Whoops. Sound 1 and sound 2. And the different curves represent the fade between them. So for example, a sound that's, let's say, sound 2. Sound 2, if sound 2 was here, so like this, that didn't do what I wanted it to. Let's say sound 2 is here. Well, what this means is that there's going to be no sound 1, it's all sound 2. So think of this as like volume, right? Versus something like this, where this is going to be sound 1's volume, and we're not going to hear sound 2. I'm probably explaining this poorly. But the idea here is that a curve is going to be a blending between them. A power curve is going to be like this, where it's going to start, it's not going to fade quickly, it's going to, or it is going to fade quickly, meaning it's going to start with one sound and it'll get loud, and it only kind of fades at the end. Versus you could have so this is a linear curve, where as the volume of one goes up, the other one goes down, and vice versa. Actually, this is a terrible graph to describe this because it's kind of discussing incompatible ranges, but okay, fine. So yeah, you can have a linear curve. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about linear, is that, you know, at the beginning, middle, and end, it's going to be the exact same kind of split all the way down. Versus like different curve types. So you can have like non-linear or whatever the case may be. That doesn't explain it super well, but let me show you here. So when we're looking at the curve, a linear curve is going to be when you have one all the way on, at halfway, they are equal in terms of volume. So they're both at, let's say, 50% volume. And then the second layer at lower volumes is going to be the only layer that you hear. So it kind of passes from one to another. if you were to change this to power, what this means is that it's exponential. So instead of being a totally straight line, it's kind of like an arch where it stays loud. And when you get to the halfway mark, instead of being 50% volume for each, they might both be like 75% volume. So instead of being a direct crossfade, it's like a curve in terms of like how the sounds are fading in and out. And then finally, you also have something called layer, which allows you to layer multiple at the exact same time. So they're both like turned up all the way. So in this case, I'm just going to say linear. And when I play something harder, you're going to hear this PW2, because when we're looking at the velocity ranges, like we can see that this is the crossfade velocity. We could actually change this as well so that it only fades in at certain volumes. But the idea here that I was going for originally is that these individual wave sequences get treated like an individual key map. So if we wanted to have like 5 slightly different wave sequences, we'd have to go into global mode under our wave sequences and save 5 or 6 or however many different versions that we wanted to have for the different velocity layers. So I might say test 00, test 01, test 02, test 03, and have those different wave sequences existing for the different velocity layers so we can manipulate it that way. So when we go into program mode, I can say, okay, I want test 00 to be the loudest, and test 01 is the next loudest, and test 02, and so on. And you can make subtle and slight differences between them so that when you play something, it's going to, it might sound a little bit random, but you have a little bit more interesting control when it comes to things like articulations. So this is something that I believe Kurt Adder does in some of his stuff when he's making these like orchestral stuff. It's using a bunch of samples, and they might behave or articulate ever so slightly differently. It's ever so slightly differently. When you use these different articulations, you're going to get different samples that are played back. And this is one of the ways that you can do that, is by making these wave sequence layers so they can behave and modulate and change and be rhythmic and do all these kinds of things. And then you can have a bunch of different layers of them that are triggered from within a single program. And this is how you can make a single program sound absolutely massive in terms of some of the different sounds that you can get out of it. Okay, so question about RPPR. So what is it? Well, RPPR is just a pattern recording. So this is another way that you can make a pattern. This isn't actually something that I do a whole lot. And the reason for that is because RPPR is something that typically only works in sequencing mode. So you can't go into a combi and just trigger RPPR. At least I don't think you can, but that's why Karma exists. But in sequencing mode, you can have this RPPR, which is basically pattern playback. And the way RPPR works in terms of pattern playback is that you can create a pattern and then assign a single pattern to a key. So this is not something, again, I don't do this very often. So I don't recall off the top of my head exactly how to do this, like step by step by step. But generally the process is you get a pattern. So you record a pattern, and it might be like a bass pattern or a drum pattern or whatever the case may be. And you can create the pattern name. And the RPPR setup is when you take that specific pattern and assign it to a key. So I'm just going to take a preset here. So like maybe a drum beat. Oh yeah, this is a good example. So I've got RPPR, C# number 2. Okay, it sounds funny because it's playing the piano instead of the drum kit. But this is the idea, is that it's got a pattern of notes that it's playing back. So let me just go back and assign a drum kit to my RPPR here. So if I go to my drums, I'll just grab a simple natural like studio kit. Okay, so what's happening? So I'm playing a single key in this RPPR, this pattern is being triggered. So now here's the thing, is that I can choose a different key for a different pattern. So maybe I go to a different preset. And again, you can record your own. So you can go into your actual play record your pattern, and then bounce it or save it as an RPPR. Or you can go into the pattern RPPR and record them here. So you can go to like the pattern edit. We've already got a pattern here, but you can record patterns. Anyway, I'm just using the presets. So under the preset, I'm going to go 22. and maybe 23. And what this allows me to do is for C sharp number 2, D2, and D sharp number 2, I've got 3 different patterns. So I can play and then change the key and then change the key again. And what's nice is that they're all tempo locked. So if I change the tempo, there we go. Okay, so the idea here is this is kind of one of those ways that you can use pre-built patterns to do things like, because this Kronos is not a, it's a sampler slash workstation. A lot of people ask, well, can you make it do what some of these other keyboards do that are arranging workstations? And so arranging workstations have things like, they'll have fills and stuff like that. And what you can do is the Kronos doesn't quite work that way. It's not really an arranger workstation. There's not a lot of, I mean, there is a sequencer, but there's things missing like a piano roll editor. So it's not really meant to do exactly what some of these other workstations do. But what you can do is you can kind of get around some of that by doing things like this RPPR. So you could have certain patterns assigned so that you've got like your pattern. Yeah, you have basically 88 different drum beats that you can assign. Now, the thing is that it's not technically 88 because you can't assign it to every single key on the keyboard. These RPPR, when it was programmed, it was designed so that it would work on all keyboards, meaning 61 keys only. So you can assign it up to 60 of those keys, which is the C sharp 2 all the way up to your C8. Oh, I guess you can assign it actually above the key range. I didn't know that. Well, that's awesome. Because I always assign stuff on my left hand. My right hand is dominant when I'm playing, so my left hand tends to be the one that will trigger samples or patterns if I'm going to use those. I didn't realize that you can actually assign it. Can you assign it any lower, though? I don't think you can. But being able to assign it above is kind of awesome, so that's good to know. But anyway, so you can have it synced. You can do different things with it. Like you can have it synchronized to like the measure, to a sequence. You can have it so that it's a trigger so that you can, when you hit it, right? So this manual mode means when you press it, it's only going to trigger while you're holding the key down, right? And then when you let go, it stops playing. You could say endless. With endless, when you hit it once, it'll start it and you hit it again to stop it. And so you could have, a whole bunch of different patterns that you've got created, including bass and drums, and you could have vocal stuff, and you could have loops. And so you could, in theory, have a whole bunch of different loops. You could basically turn your Kronos into just like a DJ workstation, and you press a single key and let it loop, and then press another key to bring another instrument in, and that kind of thing. And you can do all of that with this RPPR stuff. Yes, and all at the same time. So I could run all of these drums at the same time. And now we're hearing the new Dream Theater album. There we go. So yeah, so you've got that kind of thing where you can have a whole bunch of them. So yeah, you could just lay your arms on the whole keyboard and just start mashing and have them all play back. And again, the thing you just need to be aware of is it is going to be polyphony based. So if you've got stuff that, in theory, it's only a single oscillator that's being played, so it should be fine. But yeah, so that's the premise with RPPR. It's a neat kind of arrangement thing that you can do. But it only works in sequence mode. When you go into combi mode, there's no option to enable RPPR. The engine that handles the pattern stuff is only in sequence mode. So that's why setlist mode is really handy, because you could have, maybe you wanted to have that set up. You've got, maybe a bunch of combis, and then you could have a reference here to a sequence. And so in setlist mode, you just go to the next sequence, and then as long as you rehearsed it and that kind of thing, you know what's going to come up next, and then you can run with it. So yeah, that's kind of the idea there as well. Awesome. Okay, I'm just going to run through and see if there's any other questions that I missed, but I'm going to stick around for a little bit. I wanted to know, was there anything that anybody wanted to talk about quickly? Dirk, it looks like it's you and me, buddy. Was there anything that you wanted to take a look at? So, last thing, so we've got a few minutes here, and I'll probably round off the stream in just a minute if there's anything else that comes up. Kevin is just asking, did I talk about AMS? Actually, I briefly talked about AMS, but you know what? I've got a couple minutes. We can definitely take a look at that. And Dirk's saying, well, a new sound and program would be great. You know what? We can absolutely do that too. So I'll stick around for a little bit. Let's talk about AMS. Hey, Bart, how's it going? Oh, yeah, Presley is just a little brain fried. Look, I totally understand. The Kronos, there's a lot to it. And yeah, it's a monster workstation. It really is. Okay, so Kevin, let's talk about AMS. So AMS stands for Alternate Modulation Source. And the idea here is that you have the ability to modulate sound in a specific way using a controller. So here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to find just like a simple sound, or I'll build a simple sound here. I'm just going to grab here in a knit program. So I've got a piano sound. Let's make this a little bit more interesting. And now I'm actually going to delve into some of the programming a little bit as well. So maybe I want to make, maybe I'm producing, I'm not going to say dubstep, but maybe I'm producing some sort of like big, I'll call it a pop music synth, right? So maybe something like that. So the idea here is I'm going to create a sound. I'm going to get some synth waves here that are nice and big, so like detuned. There, I like the power saw. Okay, so what I want to do is maybe I want to make this like a big saw sound. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do things like I'm going to go back to here. I'm going to set unison mode. So when I say here, I mean, excuse me, it's the program basic vector tab. I'm going to go to unison. And what this unison does is it basically takes this oscillator and doubles it. And I'm going to take the voices and increase it. And I'm going to detune them a whole bunch. I'm going to spread the stereo up a little bit. Oh yeah, that sounds better. There we go. So I've got sort of like this, you know, I'll call it this pop synth. Right? We can make it even nastier sounding later. But to answer the question, Kevin's question about AMS. AMS is where you modulate a sound. And it depends on what it is that you want to modulate. So I'm going to use pitch to modulate with because it's really obvious when we change the pitch. So for example, pitch EG. So this pitch EG is talking about an envelope generator. An envelope generator is nothing more than something like a generator that creates a mathematical value. That's basically what this envelope generator is. Presley, I see your question. I'll get to you in a second here. And Jane, yes, I will absolutely define a sample in just a moment. So when I'm talking about samples, what I'm talking about is a fragment of sound that gets played back when you press a key. That's more or less what I'm talking about. So it could be like a non-tonal single hit. So it could be like a drum slap. It could be like the sound of glass breaking, right? So that could be a sample. It could also be like a pluck of a guitar string. And so you could pluck the guitar string and let that sample play. And so the sample is just audio being played back through the keyboard. Okay. So when it comes to EG and AMS and that kind of thing, so a modulation source is simply something that changes the sound, right? And it changes the property of the sound. So and there's a bunch of different properties. There's pitch, there's amplitude, there's volume, which is technically amplitude, but you've also got other factors. So things like the pitch of the sound might be impacted by different controller types and that kind of stuff. So what I'm getting at, when you see something that says AMS, AMS is a modulation source. It basically says allow the sound to be changed by this thing here. So modulate it. So in this case, our pitch, EG, is being modulated by the velocity by this amount. And so when we see intensity, the intensity is how much does it impact stuff? How much is it going to change the sound? Well, here's the interesting thing. This pitch EG is this tab over here. So this EG, this envelope generator, all it does is it generates value over time, right? So it either adds value or takes value away over time. And all of these fields are just changing the shape of the envelope. We're changing how the envelope behaves, how it works, how long these fields work for. So maybe what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the pitch drop. I'm going to have it start up high and then drop all the way down, right? So here's the idea. My envelope that handles pitch, right? So this is what my envelope's doing. We haven't assigned anything to it yet, but here's what happens. When a sound starts, when a keyboard is triggered, some value is created that slowly descends to 0. So hopefully that kind of makes sense, right? You've got a value that descends to 0. Well, when I go back to my oscillator page, I'm going to say, okay, my pitch EG, this thing that we just said here, is going to generate a value and go down to 0. We're going to give it some intensity. So I'm going to say, well, maybe I want it to be an octave, right? 12.0. Now what that means is that we're sending 12 notes worth of value to the pitch EG. Now, based off of what I know, this EG is going to take that plus 12 and slowly fade it down to 0. So it should start an octave high and then go down to 0 after a certain duration of time. And that duration is our time duration of 62. Now we can bring it up to 99 and that takes a little while. We can bring it down to like 11 and that's very fast. So I'm going to leave it down around 60, 70, maybe 70. And we'll see how fast that goes down. Okay. So here's our intensity. We're sending 1 octave's worth of value to the envelope generator, and the envelope generator will then take that 1 octave of stuff and do something with it. So in theory, I'm going to press a note and it should just pitch down. Perfect. That's exactly what I thought it would do. Now we could do it the other way. We could say, well, I want it to go, so we're still going to give it 1 octave's worth of value, but maybe we want it to go down. We want it to start low and go up. So I could set the start value at -99. And what this means is that this envelope generator is going to take our 1 octave's worth of value and start it low and then slowly go up to 0. So when people are asking, okay, how do we make big sweeps? How do we make like those big pads that go like... Well, this is how we do it. We're basically taking our pitch, assigning the envelope generator a certain amount of value, and then the envelope generator is going to determine what happens over time to the value that we've given it. So if we give it an octave of stuff to play with, this is what happens to it over time. But it doesn't necessarily have to be just pitch. It could be something else. It could be a filter volume. It could be a filter amount. It could be resonance. It could be sync value. It could, like, there's a whole bunch of different things. So my digression aside, Kevin, getting back to AMS, my intensity is currently at 12. So every time I play a note, doesn't matter what note I play, it's going to do that kind of rising synth thing. Well, maybe I don't want that every time. Maybe I only want that to happen when I involve a joystick. Okay? So what I can do is I can turn the intensity to 0. However, I can choose another controller, an alternate modulation source, to set the value to do stuff. So maybe I want my joystick plus Y. And my joystick plus Y is just the left-hand side joystick, like pushing it up towards the top, right? I know it's kind of hard to see in the webcam here, but you can push the joystick upwards. That's joystick plus Y. Now, when I hit joystick plus Y, let's add that same octave and see what happens. So I'm going to hold a chord, and then I'm going to push the joystick plus Y, and let's see what happens. Okay, so what's happening is this envelope generator is automatically running in the background. It just runs. And so what's happening is when I'm using my joystick plus Y and I push the stick up, what happens is it's adding this value to the envelope generator. Now this envelope generator is running regardless of what I do with my left hand. As long as I hit a note, this is going to be running in the background. So it runs independent. It's generating value. That's why it's an envelope generator. It generates value, right? And so this joystick plus Y, we're basically saying when we have the joystick moved up, it's going to add value to this envelope generator, which is running in the background, right? So basically what's happening is when I play a chord, if I wait too long and then I move the joystick up, nothing happens. Right? Barely anything happens because by the time I move the joystick up, it was already at this phase of the climb. Now, if I were to hold the joystick and then press the keys, the joystick is what's determining how much this envelope generator gets to do. So, that being said, that's what this AMS thing is. This AMS just basically allows you to assign something that will modulate the sound. One of the most common things that people use this for, if I just turn this off, is actually LFO. So LFO stands for low frequency oscillator, and an oscillator is just something that generates a sound or a wave, generates a value. And this low frequency oscillator, we're going to do that exact thing to create vibrato. So the way you would create vibrato is you have LFO that's currently assigned to pitch. So in this case, this LFO is kind of built into your oscillator 1 pitch. It's just part of the engine. So the engine already knows to assign LFO pitch, right? It knows to assign pitch to your low frequency oscillator automatically. It's got a dedicated section for it. So the intensity, if we increase the intensity to, let's say 2.0, that means at LFO1, whatever speed it's going at, is going to get, it's basically a whole tone's worth of value. Okay, so I can turn that to, let's say, an octave. And when I do an octave, it's going to go up and down very wildly. Okay, and so this LFO is going to be getting an octave's worth of value to modulate, to change. Well, what we can do is we can use a modulation source to say, well, we don't want it on all the time. We only want it on in certain occasions. So this joystick plus Y is going to be that occasion. On the occasion that you press joystick plus Y, we're going to send a certain amount of intensity to LFO1. So maybe I want that octave. Whoops, and I threw my pen on the floor. Okay, so what happens is when I move the joystick up, it's going to give up to an octave's worth of value based off of how hard I push the button or the joystick up. So it should sound like this. And so this is the idea behind an AMS, is that it allows you to modulate a function or a feature or an aspect of the Kronos. So in this case, we're modulating how much pitch is being sent to LFO1, but it could be filter, right? It could be a whole bunch of different things. So let me see here. Presley is just still not certain I grasp loading certain files I purchased from a friend in Germany because they're not in KSC. I'm assuming you mean KSC format, but instead they're a KMP with 2 KSF files with a PCG. Okay, so it sounds like what they've given you are KSF is a Korg sample format. So it sounds like they've given you the individual samples with a KMP, which is your key map that would determine how the keys, like the samples themselves, are laid out, and then a PCG, which is going to be the program that points at the samples. So it sounds like it's going to be a lot of manual loading. What you would need to do is you would need to load, so if we were to hit open, you would need to load the KSF, right? And this will give you your samples in global mode. Once that's done, you want to load your KMP, which is your key map. And in the key map, when you go to the sampling mode, the key map is going to be this thing up here. It tells you how the samples are currently laid out. So in this case, if we were to create a brand new multi-sample, here we go. We'll make it stereo. When you create a new multi-sample, this is basically your key map, which says what samples are assigned to which keys. So if I've got a sample here, right, now that this is loaded, so this one's currently assigned to C2, this key map will use the samples that you've got loaded. So generally what you'll want to do is you'll want to load all of the KSF files, then load the KMP file, and if you're not sure, you can go into sample mode, and you should be able to see the key map up here, and when you open the key map, you should be able to see all of the samples that are currently assigned to it. So in this case, like, without getting into sampling itself, like without getting into the details of sampling, because this is a little bit of a manual process, you've got a bunch of indexes, which is basically like a key zone that the sample is stretched over. Or in other words, when you play a certain key, what sample is triggered. So this is going to be heavily dependent on how they have that set up. So the files that they've given you are files that you'll have to manually load. And then once that's done, so once the key map is loaded and the samples are all individually loaded, when you load the program should then reference the key maps and the samples that you've just created or that you've just loaded. So they haven't given you a KSC file, which is the script that just kind of automatically works. So it's a little bit complicated, but it can be done. Okay, so let me see here. So Dirk's asking, do we always have to change the intensity before we hear something change so it's working? Okay, so generally speaking, yes. When you have something that, so when you look at things like LFO or envelope generators, we have to give them intensity because otherwise they don't do anything. So for example, this amp EG, this is actually one of the exceptions because this is part of what's called ADSR, which is attack, decay, sustain, release, which is a standard like for envelope kind of voltage control for amplitude. Basically, ADSR is the only one that will automatically work. So this is our volume, right? So when we're looking at ADSR, and just so everybody knows where I'm under amp EQ page, under the amp 1 EG, so our amp envelope generator. This, again, being part of the engine, this is already plugged in, so we don't need to give it any kind of intensity. This is built in. And so this is going to determine how our sound works. So for example, if I were to do this, it's going to fade in, and then it's going to drop in volume, and then it's going to stay there. And if I change my release, whenever I let go of the key, it's going to kind of fade out. Right? Okay, so fine. So this envelope for amp doesn't need to be assigned. This is just kind of built in. However, when you want to do something like filter EG, you can change the filter right away, and that's okay. So this is just a standard low-pass filter that's filtering out the highs of the sound. But what if you wanted it to, let's say, warble? I'm going to use the example warble. It's not really a great word, but to make it go wow, 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 right? So instead of the pitch going up and down, maybe we want the filter to open and close. When I go to the filter EG, well, actually, we want it to open and close repeatedly. So in this case, we're going to use an LFO as opposed to using an envelope generator. Because an envelope generator will generate the value once over a duration unless you reset it. We want an LFO because an LFO repeats over and over and over. And that's kind of what we want. We want it to open and close repeatedly. So let's take a look at this. We've got our filter mod page. So we're looking at the things that will modulate our filter. One of them is the keyboard tracking. So if we play lower notes versus higher notes, will the filter open and close more that way? And that's what all of these values represent. So in this case, the intensity is 0. So if I play a low note, which I'm getting no sound for because I've closed my filter entirely, and there's a reason for that, but we'll talk about that in a second. If I were to play a low note or I were to play a high note, the filter will not change because there's no intensity to the filter keyboard tracking. This one that says filter EG. So this is the envelope generator here. So this is the thing that generates value, and what are we sending to it? So in this field, I'm not actually sending anything because I want a different modulation. So here, filter A modulation, I've got my modulation source, so alternate modulation source, and I want to set that to LFO. Now you'll notice LFO is actually faded out. I don't have the ability to select my LFO as my modulation source. And the reason for this is because it's already hardwired. When you go to LFO, actually not LFO, when you go to filter 1 LFO mod, there's a dedicated page for it. That's what I meant by hardwired. So you can't actually set it here because it's already got a dedicated tab. But if you were to run like a different, so for example, the AL1 engine as opposed to the HD1 engine, which we're in right now, the AL1 engine doesn't have this. I don't think it has the filter LFO 1 mod tab directly. I think it has something else. But anyway, point being, I've got LFO 1 that I want to assign my intensity to. And here's my modulation source. So instead of doing aftertouch, I'm going to use the joystick plus Y again. And we're going to say in terms of intensity, I want it to be 99. I want it to go as high as it can. And what this means is that the filter is going to open and close based off of what I do when I push the joystick. Okay, so it sounds kind of funny, but let me play a chord, and then I'll slowly fade in. Now what's happening is it's also changing the pitch because I've also got the pitch assigned to the same controller. So if I were to go back to my oscillator pitch page, see how joystick plus Y is still assigned to an octave? Well, if I turn that off, so I've turned it down, now when I go back to my filter, right? So that's what's going on there. And then finally, like I can do things like when I actually go to my LFO, I can change things like the shape or the intensity or that kind of thing. So here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the filter just a little bit. There. So I just wanted to open the filter so when I play, I have kind of a default state that it starts with. And now when I go to my LFO, I can change things like the shape. So I could make it sound like a sine, so it's a little bit smoother when it opens and closes. But I could also do things like this. I could say guitar. And the reason this is guitar is because it's actually referencing how you would do a pitch bend on a guitar. A pitch bend on a guitar is different than a keyboard, where like a keyboard, you can pitch bend below the note by playing a note and then bending down. But on a guitar, you can only do that if you have a whammy bar or if you bend the neck a little bit. So in this case, they're talking about a pitch bend, which is when you play the string and then you push the string up, it's increasing the pitch. So it never goes below a certain amount. Right, so there's a few different ways of kind of assigning that. But yeah, you can change the LFO and kind of what it does. Okay, so Dirk was asking, why are some LFOs not black but gray? Well, I think I just explained that when I was explaining here. Like when we go to the filter mod page, you don't have the ability to select them because they've got like a dedicated page. So it could be, unless you're talking about a specific, like a specific place. Oh, when you push AMS. Okay. So if you're to push AMS and it's faded out, it's typically because it's assigned somewhere else. That's usually the reasoning. Awesome. Perfect. Okay. Unfortunately, I don't speak, I'm guessing that's Spanish, but I could be wrong. So if anybody's able to translate that, that would be awesome. Leonardo is asking, hi, so how to open a filter when playing the keyboard? Would it be with the filter EG? So when we're talking about filters, it really depends on how you want it to behave, right? So do you want it to start closed and open up and stay open, right? So that would let's do that scenario. Maybe we want the filter to be closed. So I'm going to bring the frequency of the filter down. Okay, actually, I'll bring it up. There, so I've got a filter. And maybe what I want it to do is, as I hold the keys, it just gets bigger and bigger. It opens more. So what I would do is, under the filter EG, I would have it start like this. So what's happening is that the filter will open more and more and more and more until at a certain point it's all the way open. And the attack is a little slow. It's going to take longer to open up than I want. So maybe I'll make the attack a little bit less. And what that means is that this is going to open the filter quickly. Now, if I were to play it now, it doesn't do anything, because we have not assigned this envelope generator to the filter. We've got the envelope generator it's generating value, but we still need to assign it to the filter itself. So this filter tab, this is where we look at the filter, but we don't want to change things here. We want to change it under the filter mod. So here we've got our filter EG. So this is the thing right here. This is the filter EG. So this is what it does. But when I click on the filter mod tab, now it gives us the ability to assign stuff to it. So I could say velocity. So maybe I want it to open or close more based off of how hard I play. Well, that's not quite what I'm doing. I want the intensity to my filter EG to always be the same. So maybe I want it to be like 90. Meaning, if this is at 39, I want to be able to add up to 90 to it. Well, actually, let's make the math a little bit more simple. The frequency's at 40 and the max it can go is 99. So if I were to put 59 plus 40, that's 99. Actually, this should stay 40. This is where we want to put 59. Anything more than 59 is going to open up the filter to its max, and it doesn't have any additional value, right? It can't go more than 99. So if I were to change this to 60 or 61 or even 80 or 90, it's not going to do anything after a certain point, because my actual filter is already open some. Now, if this was all the way at 0, then this filter mod could go up to 99, and it could have much more of an impact. But that means when I play the notes and the filter's closed, we don't hear anything, and that's maybe not what we want. So I'm going to set this back to 40. So when I play some notes, there we go. So what's happening is the filter is starting at 40, and then the envelope generator is slowly opening up. There we go. So this is a nice 80s sounding kind of synth. Okay. So this is the idea of how we would do that. So you've got your filter open a certain amount, and then you can start doing things like adding resonance, make it really sweepy sounding. Okay, so if we wanted the filter to go from open to closed, it's the exact opposite process. So all we do is, now that we've assigned the filter, we've got the filter at a certain point, right? We've got a certain amount that's being given to the envelope generator. All we do with the envelope generator is we start the level up at the top and then bring it down, right? So we can bring down to a certain point, and we can change what we want this shape to look like. So maybe we want the filter to stay open and then close, right? Or maybe we want the filter to start closing right away. So maybe what we'll do is we'll bring this, the decay back quite a bit here. Whoops. There. So maybe we want it to start closing right away. Okay, so you're just basically telling the envelope, how do you want it to behave? How do you want it to control the sound? Oh, okay, so got some questions here. Perfect. Artinio says, in Brazil, I've been 42 years old since 12. Okay. Not really a question, I guess. Okay. Perfect. Thanks for that. Since I was 12, wanted the card. They're expensive. Who knows one day. Yeah. Okay, awesome. Thanks for that explanation. Yeah, so that's kind of the idea. And then, okay, so here's what we'll do is let's wrap up the stream. I'm not going to stay too much longer, but what we'll do is we'll wrap up the stream by making some sort of sound using some of the things that we've talked about. So I've already started making kind of a sound, right? Oh, Jane asked a question and I didn't see it. So Jane, thank you for reminding me. I appreciate that. Could you give a brief walkthrough saving to a WAV file? So I've had trouble getting to save. So I had some combi portions and some basic sequences in the same song. Okay, so it sounds like, were you working with songs? Is that what you were doing, Jane? Leonardo, thanks for hearing from you. Dirk, it's been great. Thanks for joining, man. We hugely appreciate it, and appreciate all of your questions as well. Okay, so Jane, when you are working in sequence mode, and let's say you've got maybe some things that you've recorded. So one of the things that you can do with the Kronos is you can do things like you can record what are called one-shot samples. And so maybe you've got, actually, let me do this. I'm going to, in this program, maybe I want to record a sample. Okay, I'm going to get the sound to do that, but I'm also going to get it to change pitch so that it's like this pitch sweep thing. So that's fine. So under the pitch page, we'll go an octave there. Okay. And we're going to start low, but actually I want this to happen right away. So pitch EG, we want 12 here. So it's, yeah, I don't want my joystick to assign anything. I just want it to do. Okay. I like that, except I want the pitch to go the other way, like this. And I want the filter to close instead of open. So we'll just make this kind of go opposite here. And we'll bring the filter up. I realize I'm going super fast here. Okay, so that's what I wanted the sound to do. Okay. So here's my sound. One of the things that you can do is maybe you've got this one hit sample that you want to use in a song, and so you just want the sample. What I can do is I can hit sampling record on the right hand side of the Kronos. And so up here, I realize this is upside down in this camera here. Right next to your tempo knob, there's something that says sampling record. When you hit that, it's armed. And you can hit start stop. Now what will happen is when the start stop is enabled, so this sampling record basically means record the output of the Kronos. So anything that it's sending out, record it. Start stop does exactly that. Now it doesn't start recording until it hears something, until you start playing. Now I hit stop. And what's happened is under the sampling recording, start stop, when I go to sample mode, so if I hit sampling here, I now have, let me create a new multi-sample. I'm not going to name it anything. But now what happens, in sampling mode, I have got a new sample that exists. So I have got this one that I loaded earlier, but now I've got this new sample that I just played. And when I play the key, it's going to play back the sample I just made. And now you can do this with entire parts. You could do this with individual instruments. There's a lot of stuff that you can do just like with that sample record. Maybe it's, for example, maybe you want to use like an organ. And instead of doing a big organ slide manually with your hands, you could record the big organ slide by itself using that sample recording, and then you could just press a single key to trigger that organ slide if you don't have enough keys to be able to do that. So there's like little things that you can do with that. So anyway, this sample has now been recorded as a single key. And you can do that with loops, and you can do that with all kinds of things. So, okay, so you've got your sample that you're using. When you're in sequence mode, one of the things that you have the ability to do is you can bounce tracks. So if let's say you've got a big recording and you've got a bunch of stuff and you wanted to bounce that as a track. One of the things that you should be able to do, and I want to say it's See, this is not, I'll be very honest when I say I use the sequencer very, very minimally. I use it for practice, and that's basically it. When I do sequencing, I do everything in a digital audio workstation, and I use it to trigger the Kronos as a sound source. So I don't actually do the editing on the Kronos. I do all of my editing on a computer. But that being said, you do have the ability to bounce your tracks down to audio. And so, and I'm trying to remember exactly where this is, because this isn't something that I do very often. But there is a way where, and shoot, I don't remember exactly where it is, but it's going to be in a menu in the top right hand corner anyway. Once you've got a bunch of your stuff recorded, you can go to the top right hand corner, and there's an option where you can, it's basically, it says bounce to track. Is it here? Aha. There we go. Okay. So I think I found it. So when you go to the drop down at the top, you can say auto HDR sampling setup, and this is going to basically ask you how do you want to have this configured. So you can say bounce audio track, and you get to choose which audio tracks you want to bounce to a single wave file, right? And so you can say the mode and that kind of thing. There. Now, that's not necessarily going to bounce it to audio right away, though. There is a way that you can do it, and it just runs through it. And I'd honestly, I'd have to check the manual to tell you exactly how to do this. I don't do it off the top of my head. But the idea here, at least for sequencing, is that you can do it that way. Okay. Big guy in the sky. Thank you. Just lurked, but this tool is awesome. Okay, you're quite welcome. I'm glad that you jumped in here. So Jane's asking, which system do I use? Pro Tools. So I actually use a variety of things when it comes to actual wave editing itself. So let's say I'm editing a wave file. I don't necessarily want to edit the wave file on my Kronos. I'll typically edit it on the computer itself. And for that, I use, oh shoot, what's it called? Audacity. So Audacity, there we go. So I will use Audacity as my waveform editor. So if I'm editing individual wave files, this is typically where I go, and I'll kind of work with that. When it comes to actual DAW work, I've got a couple. I used to use Sonar X3 for a while, and now they have a free one that's out that's called Cakewalk by, what is it, Cakewalk by Sonar, or Sonar by Cakewalk, or I forget exactly. It's Cakewalk, basically. They've got a free version, and it's got a lot of MIDI control, and it's got integrated sound. Like, it's a fully functional DAW that has a lot of effects, a lot of features and stuff, and it's all free. And I've been using that for a long time, and I'm a big fan of that one. Peter, greetings from Poland. Well, greetings from Canada. Mike's asking, great stuff, Dave. Go to my Facebook page. Okay, so you've got a big, okay, so that's something that we can definitely check out at some point. Definitely appreciate that. So Burger 2605, can you show 2 rhythm and combi and 1 rhythm and 1 for click and send to drums? Oh, okay, I see. I think I understand what you're asking. So are you asking how would you send a specific sound, let's say, to an external drum kit so the drummer could listen to a click or that kind of thing? Yes, I can absolutely show you that. Thanks, Jane. I appreciate that. I'm going to be logging off fairly shortly, but I feel like I'm on a roll, so I'm going to hang around for a little bit. Okay, so the idea of sending a track to a different output is absolutely something that the Kronos is capable of. And so the part that makes it difficult in this tutorial or in this kind of live stream is that I don't have an output plugged in that you'd be able to hear independently, but I'll show you the premise. Okay, so the idea here is, let's say, well, okay, first things first, what I would do if it were me, I'm gonna start on a new combi and just kind of be totally blank here. Okay, so I've got an initial combi. One of the things that I might do is I might put a click track and output that click track on a different output so that my drummer can hear it, right? So that we're all kind of in sync, right? Well, what I would do is in combi mode, I'm going to go to my drum track. And so my drum track is going to be under right here. So it's under EQ vector control. The subtab is drum track. And these are the presets. Now you could record your own as well. So you can go into sequence mode, record your own sequence, save it as a pattern or that kind of thing as a drum track. I'm going to use one of the presets. And I think it's under 400 and something. There's like a click. It's just a simple metronome click. And I'm trying to remember exactly where it is. Is it 480 something? No. Maybe it's in the 300s, but there is a metronome click in here somewhere. Shoot, where did it go? 417. Ah, thank you. There it is. Okay, so here's our metronome click. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind is there's two aspects to the Kronos. There's audio and MIDI. And this is one of the hard things to kind of differentiate, is that the Kronos is technically two workstations in one. It is both a sound generating engine as well as a MIDI controller at the same time. It's all built into the same system. And what will happen is we need to kind of differentiate MIDI from audio. So that being said, I've got a drum track, and you'll notice on MIDI channel 2, it's playing the piano over and over and over. Okay, probably not what we want. What we want to do is we probably want to have like a drum or a MIDI click on a different channel entirely. So here's what I'm going to do. Instead of outputting on MIDI channel 2, I'm going to make that output on MIDI channel 16. Now, by default, it's actually MIDI channel 10 that handles drums. That's just kind of the MIDI standard, but I'm going to put it on 16 because I'm doing everything from within the Kronos and I don't really care. So here's what's going to happen. Now when I play the drum track, you'll notice it's track 16 that's playing. You'll see the VU meter light up here. Okay. So timbre 16 is being used. That means I have tracks 1 through 15 that I can use to put all of my sounds into. So this is the first part. We've got our sound. The second thing is our insert effects. So our insert effects are the parts that deal with the actual audio. So if we've already got our MIDI being controlled one way, that's the sound generation itself. Now we need to route the audio itself through something. Now here, we were working with MIDI track 16, right? LNR is your default bus. So if I were to grab the back, like the cables in the back of my Kronos, the LNR bus is the LNR mono stereo output that you see in the very, very top left-hand corner. IFX1 is an insert effects routing. So this is a routing of an effect. So if you wanted to have something like reverb on one of your effects, you might need, like on your click, you might need to assign it like to IFX12. But generally what most people are going to do, like if I were to send a click track to my drummer so we can all play in tempo, what I would do is instead of sending it to IFX12, I'm going to send it to bus 1 or bus 2 or bus 3 or bus 4. In those 4 buses, so the bus that goes 1, 2, 3, 4, and then there's stereo, which is 1 and 2 or 3 and 4, those are the 4 outputs that are in the back of the Kronos. So on the back of the Kronos, and again, you can't see it in this webcam, but it says LR mono, but then it has output 1, 2, 3, and 4. Well, those are outputs 1, 2, 3, and 4. Those are physical buses that you can plug cables into. And so what I would do is I would send my drum track on MIDI channel 16. I would use the insert effect to route the audio to channel 1. And what's going to happen is when I hit play, you'll notice the VU meter is hitting, but it's not playing any sound. The reason for that is because the sound is physically coming out of a different jack on the back of the Kronos. If I were to unplug this jack, I'm going to unplug one of them, and I'm going to plug it into bus 1. Suddenly you can hear it. Okay. And if I go back and I plug everything back in, you still can't hear it despite it playing. So let me just change the routing really quickly here, and I'm going to send it back to LNR. Okay. Yeah, I should probably assign this to a drum as well. So I'm just going to choose like a drum category here. Whoops. If I choose by category and then drums, I'm going to use just a standard kit. There we go. There. So now it sounds like that. And what you can do is if you wanted a different timbre, you can just change the pitch to choose like a different sound. There we go. So maybe I like the hi-hat sound. Okay. So now that we've got the hi-hat sound, it's outputting to LNR. When we go to IFX, right, we unselect this D kit, this drum kit, and then we can change it to like 1. And this will output out of the 1 spot or the 1 jack on the back of the Kronos. And you can route that to the front of the house or you can route that to your drummer, and then you've got an independent click track. Okay. So hopefully that answers your question. Leonardo is asking, I have a last question. If Korg comes out with a Kronos successor, will you be willing to get it? Kronos can do so much stuff. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The Kronos can do a lot of stuff, but I will fully admit there's a lot of stuff that it still does not do. Something that Kurzweil has been doing since 1990 or even before. So we're talking, well over 30 years ago. I say well over, it's been 31 years. So Kurzweil has file linking so that when you, for example, load a combi, in their version they call it a multi, not a multi, shoot, I haven't used my Kurzweil in a while. But anyway, it's called a setup, and a setup is like a combi. If you load a setup, it has something that are called dependent objects. So it'll load all of the objects that combi, or in this case, the multi or setup, it needs to make it sound correct. It'll load all of the dependencies into the system. Kronos still doesn't do that, even though it's a brand new system. But so to answer your question, generally, it really depends on a couple of things. One, price is always going to be the first factor. If it's $20,000 like the Oasis was when it first came out, I am not buying that. But if it's similarly priced to the Kronos, I would be happy to sell one of my Kronoses and get the new version. So if it's like $5,000 or $6,000, I'm not necessarily opposed to that. But it also depends on what does it offer, what are the advantages, does it do something that the Kronos simply cannot do, what does it do that's so, like, how do I justify spending $6,000 on another synth? How do I convince my wife that I want to spend $6,000 on another keyboard when I have so many already? So there's a lot of justification that would need to happen there. But generally speaking, if it's priced fairly well, yeah, I would certainly consider it. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so Mike's saying, can you quickly show a combi that has an acoustic guitar with a strum karma assigned to it to any octave so that you can have a second voice to another section? My strum just stops playing. So the second voice when played. Okay, so I think I understand what you're saying. So let's jump into karma just basically. And when I say just basically, I mean I still fumble around with karma myself quite a bit. I can make it do some basic stuff, and I'll show you some of the things that I can make it do. But when it comes to really, really advanced karma stuff, you really need an independent piece of software which allows you to edit karma outside of the Kronos. You can almost think of Kronos as like a karma playback machine, but you can't really do a lot of editing on karma in the Kronos. You can edit a lot of the parameters and you can customize it, but if you wanted to make like a custom karma pattern, a lot of that you have to do in the software outside of the Kronos and import it in as a KGE file, because karma doesn't exist in just the Kronos. Karma was made by Stephen K, and it's its own independent sound generation and manipulation engine, which was licensed by Korg originally back in 1999 with the Korg Karma. I think it was 1999. Anyway, around that period of time, 96 to 99, the Korg Karma came out and it used his technology. But there are other engines that also make use of karma, so it's not just the Kronos. So if you want the full capabilities of karma, you need an independent piece of software. So that being said, manipulating and using kind of karma in a basic way. Here's how I approach it. Let's say I'm using a guitar strum, right? So just in the case of Mike's question, he's saying, how would I bring it in and like use it to strum and then have like an independent section without cutting off the strumming? Hopefully I've got the question down kind of in the right vein of what you're asking. So one of the things that I tend to do is I tend to find, with karma anyways, I find a preset that sounds similar to what I want it to do. So the first thing I would do is I would go to program mode and I would start looking for guitars and find one that has a karma pattern that I like. So I might go to my category search. I might go to my guitars. Maybe it's an acoustic guitar. Maybe it's a steel string. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, okay, so that's a sound. I'm going to put on karma. Yeah, not quite what I was looking for. Maybe I want something that's actually like strumming. So maybe steel strings will strum. Okay, doesn't sound the greatest, but it will do for what we're looking for. So here's what I'm going to do. I found internal C66 has the karma thing that I was looking for. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to combi mode, and I'm actually going to copy that in. So I'm going to go to the menu in the top right, and I'm going to say copy from program. And when I do, I get to copy the sound as well as other things like effects, karma, drum track, and I get to choose where I put it. So in this case, I'm going to say IFX all used. So I'm going to use all of the insert effects that come from the steel strings. If I were to say all, in combi mode, it's just going to completely overwrite all of my insert effects, regardless of ones that I've set up already. So instead of doing that, I'm just going to say all used. Master effects and total effects, because this is the first sound I'm bringing in, I'm fine to use those, but generally speaking, I would leave those off. And the reason for that is because you might have master effects that include chorus and delay, but then other sounds you bring in might not want to use that, and they'll start using that sound because they're shared. Master effects and total effects are shared. And so without getting into the details of IFX and total effects and all of that stuff, that's the premise. But here's the part that I'm interested in is with karma. And now karma has 4 modules. It has module A, B, and C, and D, and they all do different, well, they don't all have to do different things, but think of those as individual engines that will run and make things happen. So module A could be drums, module B could be guitar strumming, module C could be some sort of, other control, maybe it's panning, and like those kinds of things. So these modules all do different things, and you get to choose which module you want to bring in. I'm just bringing in module A because I'm pretty sure that was the strumming module, and we're bringing it into timbre 1. So when I hit OK, now I should be able to turn on karma. There, okay, so it's strumming. It, again, doesn't sound the greatest, but okay, it works. Okay, so the second part, or the second aspect of this, is actually karma itself. So when we go to karma GE, we can see what's being assigned where. So we can see module A is running and that kind of thing. So that gives you the overview. But what we want to do is we actually want to go into karma itself. We can see the setup and we can see the patterns that are currently being used. So in this case, module A is running. Well, when we turn karma on, it's running. Okay. I'm just going to turn that volume down a little bit here. Okay, so we've got something that strums. And we can choose different strum patterns here. So that's fine. And here, this is where we get to choose things like the zone range. So this is more of like a trigger range. Where is it getting triggered from? So from C-1 to the top is B3. Well, maybe I want that to be somewhere like closer to G3. And the shortcut that I'm using to kind of just make this automatically jump is I'm holding the Enter key on the keyboard. And when you press a key, right, it automatically changes to the key that you're kind of selecting. So that's just a quick shortcut thing. Okay. So this is one of the ways that you can kind of minimize the zone. That way, when karma's on, if I play higher notes above G3, notice it doesn't strum. So it's just triggering just the individual notes, right? So that's one thing that you can do. The second thing that you can do that kind of works with that is that you can also set your zone range, right? So what you can do here is under your keyboard zone. So it's MIDI filter zones, your keyboard zones. You'll notice right now it goes all the way up to G9, which means that guitar will play that entire range as well. So one of the things I could do is I could bring that down to G3. And when I play Karma, and so this is probably what's happening to you. Karma is trying to trigger notes above this range, but can't, right? I'm guessing that's probably what's happening. So what we can do is we can leave that zone range all the way up to the top. That way Karma sounds the way it's supposed to. Okay. But then what we can do is we can reassign the MIDI control so that when you play on your keyboard, it doesn't do anything. It's only Karma that generates the sound, right? So you'll notice right now, my sound is coming out of MIDI track 1, and this is found under the MIDI page, so timbre parameter MIDI. That means all of my output is coming from track 1. Well, maybe I don't want that. And this is a little bit more of a complicated setup in terms of Karma, but what we're telling Karma is we're saying based off of the notes that we play, take that input and output it on a different MIDI channel. So in this case, I'm saying, okay, I don't want my guitar to come out of MIDI channel 1. I want it to come out of, let's say, MIDI channel 2. But what's happening is when I play, no sound comes out. Well, what we need to do is we need to tell Karma to listen on a different MIDI channel. So here, okay, and we'll change that to something else entirely, 3, 4. Okay, so I think I've got it a little bit backwards here, where what I've done is, yeah, okay, so I've got multiple MIDI channels that are happening here. Okay. Okay. Let me turn off my, there. Okay, so what I've done is under my keyboard zones MIDI, my timbre parameter MIDI page, the guitar sound is coming out of MIDI channel 2. Okay, so when I play the notes with Karma off, what's happening is Karma is basically listening on MIDI channel 2 and sending it to this output for me. Right, so MIDI channel 2. When I go to Karma, I can see my input channel is general channel or global channel. And this global channel means any MIDI input is going to be received. And then we can output it on a certain zone, right? So what that allows us to do is something like this, where what we do is let's say we've got a second sound and that second sound is just piano. Okay, so I'm going to go like this. I'm going to go, I want this to be, okay. So now I could have it set up such that my MIDI keyboard zones, I could have the zone range for my piano be a specific range. So when I play lower notes, this is where the strumming I want to have happens down here, and then the rest happens above. So I've got kind of like a limited range here. So what happens, let's bring that all the way up to the top here again. There. So now when I play with Karma, I can leave this chord running in the background. Even when I play different chords, even though I was playing different chords in the right hand, Karma isn't looking at the right hand. It's not looking at that zone for input, so it doesn't care. It disregards it. So what you can do is you have a zone on your left hand that allows you to run with this Karma stuff. Let it run in the background. You can do your chord changes there. Right? right? Whatever it is that you're doing, and they're kind of separate from one another. So hopefully there's a lot of information in there, and there's a lot that I'm also leaving out because I don't know it off the top of my head with Karma, but that's one of the things that you can do to kind of jump in. And a couple of other things just quickly, if you aren't aware with Karma, these sliders on the left-hand side can change how Karma behaves. So in terms of like strumming patterns, are they staccato? What is the rhythm type, and so on. And one of the things you can do to figure that out is when you go to the Karma tab, go to this page here that says GE RTP scenes, generated effect RTP or real-time parameter scenes. This is going to show you what parameter is assigned to which module, and what module control does what. So module A, which is the one that we were using, has a bunch of different things that you can do, and you can see what they're assigned to, right? So you can see switches and sliders, and you can see their kind of minimum, maximum, and default values. So that allows you to do things like this. So maybe I wanted to change the swing. Well, right now the value is 50, and it goes from 0 to 100, well, 102. And that's slider 1. So it stands to reason that when I'm listening to a pattern on slider 1, if I were to move slider 1 with the real-time knobs Karma engaged, it's going to change the swing style. Is it not doing it? No, that's just my volume. Okay, so what I'm doing is I was hitting the Karma Scenes button up top, and those Karma Scenes buttons, here, let me change the volume. Those Karma Scenes buttons are changing the actual pattern itself. This is kind of where that's built into Karma. But then you should be able to choose individual sliders, and those are going to, well, typically what they do in program mode anyway, is they will change things like the rhythm, or they'll change the template duration. So you can even edit it manually here. So now when I run it, there we go. Listen, if you can hear that. So notice how it's changing the rhythm, or how it's swinging, or you can change things like replications and so on. So you can change a lot of aspects of Karma that way as well. And so this is one of the things that I lean on, is that, you know, page 116 and 17 to 32 is just changing some of these default values and seeing how it impacts how Karma is controlling stuff. So those are all things that I would kind of look for or play with Karma. Okay. So Nova Creative Music is saying, Kronos is great, but I wish it had more polyphony at this price range. Do you have any hacks to be more efficient with polyphony, or any software hardware hacks involving polyphony? You know what? That's actually a really great question. I just kicked my mic stand and now it's moving my camera. Sorry. 1 second. There we go. Okay. So when it comes to polyphony, polyphony is a bit of a beast on the Kronos, and there's a reason for that, which is it's not that the polyphony on the Kronos is bad at this price range. It is variant depending on the engine that you use. So, for example, there are certain engines. So there's 9 sound engines in the Kronos. There's the HD1, the AL1, which is your analog engine, your CX3, which is your organ engine, your EP1, which is for your electric pianos, your SGX, which is your SGX, Berlin Grands, and so on. All of those kinds of things. There's so many different engines, and they all have different polyphony. The worst, when I say the worst, I mean the one that eats up the most polyphony, is either the plucked string engine. So if I just bring up an engine here, and this is all going to be in the EXI banks. So let me just bring up one of these quickly here, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So an EXI program, when I go to common, this is where you can see the different engines that exist. So the plucked string engine uses physical modeling, and that's fairly CPU intensive. So you're going to that's going to eat up polyphony quite a bit. The Mod 7 is also, it's basically a powerhouse of a DX7. It basically uses wave shaping, where it's additive synthesis. So, you take one waveform and that mathematically amplifies or changes the shape of another waveform, and you can piggyback those up to like 6 at a time directly into one another and so on. So these two, this pluck string one and the Mod 7 one, those are both really polyphony heavy. You don't get a lot of notes out of them. But then there are some that are really, really easy. So for example, the Poly 6 is a very simple synth, and that synth, I believe, has like 200 notes of polyphony. So you can do some really fantastic things with different engines. So if you've got a sound that exists in one engine, and you're trying to modify it to give it more polyphony, I would say try and make it in different engines that are going to have naturally more polyphony. So what I mean is the Poly 6, the AL1 is pretty good, as well as the HD1 engine. Those are the three that will give you the most polyphony to make your sounds with. So if you can make your sounds with those three engines, use those first, and only use things like the Mod 7 or the pluck string if you absolutely need to make a sound in a specific way. Okay, so is it Birendra was asking, when I plug in a guitar and use Guitar Program to play the guitar, I was not able to edit the sound. Without getting into more detail, I think I would need to know what you're recording into and that kind of thing. But what I would say is when you're recording audio from an external source on the Kronos, one of the things that you need to do is in global mode, you actually have to go to audio. So when you go to basic and then audio, the Kronos doesn't have its buses internally turned on by default. So for example, input 1 is off by default. You have to choose where to route it to be able to record from it. Otherwise, it's not going to hear anything. So this is probably one of the things that you need to be aware of, is to be able to record it, to be able to hear it, you need to enable the input. So for example, a USB, like an external controller or an external USB sound card, you have to route the audio to be able to hear it. And until these VU meters light up, when you're like if you've got an external guitar plugged in to, like, let's say input 1, I'm just going to turn this one off, but input 1, you might have to route that to your LR bus before it will show up. And once you've routed it to the LR bus, then you can like do sample recording and that kind of thing. So it's really dependent on how like the audio is configured in the Kronos. Okay, so Mike was saying, so to play a single chord strum and while holding to play the second solo voice to see if the strum keeps going. Okay, so yeah, we kind of worked through that. Okay, awesome. So Brian's asking, can this same approach be used for multiple keyboards? You're a bit of a newbie and you just got a Kronos and own a Yamaha P15. Okay, so I think I just need a little bit more info. So in terms of the same approach, when it comes to an approach for like programming or sound design, synths in general are all generally the same. They generate a sound, they have some sort of filter that it runs through and that kind of thing. So the principles are all the same, but how they assign stuff, how you interface, and those kinds of things are going to vary from synth to synth. So if you were to plot me right now in front of a Yamaha Montage, it might take me a little while to work through the user interface, but programming sounds on it are going to be exactly the same from synth to synth. It's just where do you go to get certain things done. Awesome. Kevin's saying, thanks again for doing this. You're doing a great job. Thank you so much. I'll be going through the whole 3 hours multiple times in the next few weeks. No, you know what? Like I say, it's a lot of information, and it takes a while to digest. So no, I appreciate that. New to the Kronos, I'm going to mid in October. So 2 questions: how to properly use the knobs and sliders. I know they do something for organ drawbars. And 2, where to start when creating new sounds. Okay, I'm not going to spend too much more time. I think it's I'm going to get back to my day, but I do want to say thank you so much for everybody for joining. I'm going to try and answer these last little bit of questions quickly to give you at least maybe a direction, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay, so when it comes to the drawbars, and this is not specific to necessarily just the Kronos, but this is more of a control pattern thing. So the control design with the Kronos is on the left-hand side. And again, if you're kind of sitting at the Kronos, I'll describe some of what these buttons do. But generally speaking, what happens is you've got a control assignment on the left-hand side, and this whole kind of pad, this whole area, minus the nano pad, so I'm just going to move this. So this whole controller assignment is not only assignable, but it's a multi control surface. And so these buttons on the left-hand side change what this control surface does. That's why you'll have different colored lettering. So you'll see like pan and cutoff are actually different colors when you look at the font, or you'll see like mix, play, mute, but then in a different color font, it has karma scenes. What it's basically saying is, in different modes, these will control different things. So when it comes to general control, typically your timbre track control in the top left-hand corner is going to be your yellowish or lighter font. That's pan and EQ cutoff and low EQ and frequency EQ and that kind of thing. And then these sliders are going to be for volume. But that's in combi mode. When you're in program mode, they do something different, right? So it depends on the mode that you're in. If you're in sequence mode, they do something different. If you're in program mode, they do something different. Generally, the timbre track is going to be volume control. Unless it's an individual instrument like the CX3 engine, you can use these as sliders or faders. So if I were to bring up some sort of organ program, here, let me see. Bring up an organ, yeah, Keith Emerson, good enough. So when you move your sliders, by default, when you have timbre track, it doesn't do anything. When you go to tone adjust EQ, your tone adjust, this is where these controller assignments actually belong to what's happening in the organ. So if we've got, now I have no output right now because for whatever reason, the sound's not coming out. But this is where you would normally, like if you hold a chord, you can move these and this will change your assignment, right? So it depends on what the program is. It depends on, right? It depends on what it is that you're kind of working with. So yeah, that's what these buttons on the side do. So you've got your timbre track, your audio, EXT is your external control, that's for MIDI. But the big two that you're probably going to use is the timbre track, and this other one that says RT knobs karma. And the RT knobs karma is just these, basically all of these knobs and sliders then belong to karma. So when you've got karma running doing something, and in this case it doesn't actually do anything, but when you've got karma running, you can move these sliders to change how karma works and behaves and gives you sound. So when it comes to answer your question with regards to creating new sounds, I would say there's kind of two approaches. The first approach is look at an existing preset, see what they did, and then modify it. So that's a good way to start. The second approach is completely from scratch, and I'm more of a fan of the latter approach, which is starting completely from scratch, because sometimes when you modify a preset, you don't necessarily know what assignments have been done, so it can be doing something that you don't want it to do. And so if you start totally from scratch and you're like, okay, how do I start making the sound right? And this, just sound programming itself, is something I could talk for hours about. So outside of the Kronos, just generally speaking, you want to listen for sound changes and like what are you trying to get the sound to do. So you have things like filter and amplitude. So you have your timbre, which is what the filter changes. You have your timbre. You have your amplitude. So how loud is it? You have all these different things that make up a property of a sound. And you want to go, okay, how do I get what I'm working on or listening to right now closer? And what are some of the things that, like, what are the tools that you can use to do that? So it's a very long answer. It's a very complicated question. But generally speaking, I would say if you want to get started, find a preset that exists and edit it and see what changes when you make a change, right? What happens when you make a change? Yeah, so Mike's asking, hopefully this will stay online. And yes, so this will be online. I'm going to leave this up. I want to make sure that people have access to it. So because again, a lot of information. So if it's recorded on video, you can always review it. So yeah, absolutely. I'll make sure that it stays up. Presley's asking, are you savvy on incorporating controllers such as the Behringer FCB 1010? So that's that big foot pedal, isn't it? Like with all the different things. I'm trying to assign some parameters to one of the expression pedals. So Interestingly enough, I don't have a lot of experience with expression pedals, but from a Kronos perspective, I can tell you the basics in terms of controller assignments. So again, it depends if you're in combi mode or program mode or that kind of thing. What I would say is in global mode, one of the first things that you can do is in global mode, you can look at MIDI controllers. And this is kind of the MIDI setup for the whole Kronos. So maybe you want an expression pedal to always control volume. It's the kind of thing that you can go here and say, okay, well, what do these controller assignments do? What do I want them to control? But generally speaking, it's really, really, MIDI's a very, very powerful thing, and you have a lot of control in the Kronos. So it depends on what's being sent into the Kronos. So if you're using the FCB 1010 and you've got like an expression pedal, and that expression pedal is sending MIDI continuous controller on a certain MIDI channel, you have to make sure that the Kronos is designed or equipped to receive that MIDI in and do something useful with it. And that often comes down to programming in combi mode. And so this is the power of combi mode, is not the sounds. The sounds come from program mode. Combi mode brings them all together, but then you have this added ability to impact what's being sent where through MIDI. So you can filter certain things out, or you can redirect certain things. So I don't have a direct answer for you specifically for the, for that foot pedal, but generally speaking, yeah, this is something that the Kronos can do. And I would recommend, even if you're only using a single sound, try doing your MIDI control stuff from combis. You just have a lot more control over them that way. Okay. Richard's saying, I'm interested in copying a single program from my Kronos and importing it into my Karma keyboard. So if you've got a Karma keyboard, so if you've got both a Kronos and like a Karma from, I think, was it 1999, like the red ones, it's not going to work. And the reason I say that is because Karma doesn't have the same sound engine that the Kronos does. So the Kronos uses the HD1 engine, where Karma uses the high synthesis engine, which came from the Triton and the Trinity, I believe, something like that. So the information that's stored in a PCG file that allows you to load stuff is different in the Karma. The Karma doesn't have the same waveforms, for example. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff that they're not necessarily backwards compatible. So that's not really something that you might be able to do. Mike's saying, I wish Kronos would create a more attractive, colorful interface, like my Phantom Grand. Yeah, you know what? I have a lot to say about design UIs, like user interface. I'm not a UI specialist by any stretch, but I've been working with software development teams and stuff like that for quite a long time. There's some stuff that they do wrong. There's some stuff that they do right. I would like to see a major overhaul myself, though. Brian's saying, your video is a major reason I decided to purchase the Kronos. Oh, awesome, man. Thank you. I love what the Kronos does. Their stuff, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not necessarily a Kronos fanboy. I just have yet to find a better synth out there that does all of the things that I need it to do as well as it does. It's far from perfect, though. But I'm really glad that me having a little bit of knowledge and just trying to share it, that, yeah, if you're running a Kronos too, that's awesome. Okay, so Miranda's asking, are we able to connect Phantom Power microphone to Kronos? You know what? That's a really good question. I haven't ever actually tried it, but I'm pretty sure it does have Phantom Power, which is actually why. Actually, I'm pretty sure it does. You know what? I would defer to the manual for that one. I don't know off the top of my head. So Korgman, thank you for the video. Any tips on loading a DX7 preset in the Kronos? Yeah, actually, what you're looking for is something that's called, I believe it's an SYX file. DX7 does actually natively load into the Kronos. And if I look at my old backup, I think I had a bunch of DX7 stuff kicking around. I just want to see if I had any nearby. But DX7 files do natively load. I believe they're SYX file format, but the Kronos does have the ability to load them in, and I'm not going to spend some time searching all over through my hard drive for it, but they do exist, and you can load them in just as regular programs. So yeah, absolutely something you can do. Robert saying, thanks for your help. Hope you get time to do more of this. Also worth you looking at Reaper DAW for your own use. Okay, I have heard of Reaper. Obviously, it's like one of the major ones. I'm when I do recording and stuff like that, I tend to be like, I want to get in and just record. So my interest in learning a new DAW is fairly low. But that being said, I have heard incredible things about Reaper as well. So maybe something I'll look into. Wonderful tutorial. Thank you very much. You know what? I'm gonna wrap it up here. I'm gonna say thank you to all of you. I wasn't expecting to do the stream this long. I just kind of wanted to jump on and talk about some stuff, but a lot of you coming in supporting, like Mike, thank you so much for that. All of you, Presley, Dirk, all of you guys that showed up. Thank you so much for allowing me to be able to do this and share some of my knowledge. And if you have questions, I try and reply on YouTube and that kind of thing. So please feel free to reach out. And, I'll definitely want to do more of this, and maybe sometime we'll do something that's maybe a little bit more targeted to a specific thing, like as opposed to just kind of jumping around the Kronos like crazy. There's a lot of stuff there to look through. So maybe sometime we'll spend some going in depth in programming. So some things I wanted to look at. But thank you everyone so much for your support, for your time. And I hope you've enjoyed. So have a great day, everyone. Happy New Year, and look forward to doing more of this in the future. So take care, everyone.